There are over 600 people on California death row. Douglas Stankewitz, 46 years on death row. Stankewitz was 19 when he shot Teresa Graybill, 22, in 1978. His death sentence was overturned by the state Supreme Court in 2008. He was resentenced to death in 2009, and that was overturned by the Ninth Circuit in 2012. He has since been awaiting a resentencing trial in Fresno County. James Anderson, 45 years on death row. Anderson kidnapped, robbed, and killed a woman and her grandmother whose car had stalled along an interstate. He was accused of, but never tried, for the killing of a third person. His sentence was overturned in 1987, but he was retried and again sentenced to death in 1991. David Ghent, 45 years on death row. Ghent raped and stabbed to death Patricia Burt, 25, in her house in 1979. He claimed a blackout from his service in Vietnam. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2002 set aside the sentence because of improper police interrogation. The Santa Clara County District Attorney decided in 2013 against seeking death, but a retrial is still pending. Earl Jackson, 45 years on death row. Jackson beat to death two elderly women, ages 81 and 90, and essayed one with a wine bottle during robberies of their adjoining apartments. The verdict was affirmed by the state Supreme Court in 1980, but a federal appellate panel vacated his sentence in 2008, and he was convicted again in 2010. Richard Montiel, 45 years on death row. After robbing an elderly woman, he robbed and murdered an elderly man who was at home alone during the day. His sentence was overturned, but he was resentenced in 1986. Fermin Ledesma, 44 years on death row. After a gas station attendant identified Ledesma as one of two men who had robbed the station, Ledesma returned and shot him to death. Jerry Bunyard, 43 years on death row. Bunyard asked Erlene Popham on November 1, 1979, to kill his pregnant wife Elaine so that he could be with another woman with whom he was having an affair. Popham received life with the possibility of parole. Michael Bergner, 43 years on death row. Bergner was convicted of murdering William Arias during a convenience store robbery. The state Supreme Court twice reversed his death penalty, but affirmed it in 2016 on the third hearing. Jackson Daniels, 43 years on death row. After a series of crimes that included 10 bank robberies, carjackings, and the killing of a man during a drug robbery, Daniels crashed a stolen car during a police chase into another vehicle, killing the driver. He subsequently was shot 14 times in a shootout with the police, but survived. Daniels was paralyzed from the waist down after being shot by the police following a bank robbery. When two Riverside police officers came to the home where he was bedridden to take him to prison for the robbery, he shot and killed both of them. John Davenport, 43 years on death row. Davenport tortured and stabbed to death a woman he met at a bar, impaling her corpse on a stake. His death penalty was reversed but reinstated after a new sentencing trial. Oscar Gates, 43 years on death row. In 1979, Gates killed a fellow member of an Oakland forgery ring in a dispute over splitting their proceeds. Convinced he is the heir of Howard Hughes, who has been targeted by an elaborate conspiracy, he was declared mentally incompetent to proceed in his appeals until the U.S. Supreme Court struck down such indefinite stays. Jesse Gonzalez, 43 years on death row. Gonzalez killed a sheriff's deputy and fired at another as officers raided a house during a narcotics investigation. Joe Johnson, 43 years on death row. Johnson crept into an apartment and killed the occupant, hitting the sleeping man in the head with a barbell. 2 days later, he essayed a woman in a church. His death penalty was reversed, and he was retried and condemned a second time. Eric Kimball, 43 years on death row. Kimball killed the owners of a stereo equipment store at their home, then used their keys to enter and ransack that store. Jarvis Masters, 43 years on death row. Masters was part of a conspiracy in which San Quentin State Prison inmates attacked and killed a guard. The inmate who did the stabbing was sentenced to life without parole. Ward Weaver, 43 years on death row. Weaver killed an 18-year-old Air Force recruit and his girlfriend after encountering them on the highway in a disabled car. Willie Brenner, 42 years on death row. Brenner, or James Willis Johnson, killed the owner of a jewelry store during a robbery with two other accomplices. Albert Brown, 42 years on death row. Brown waylaid a 15-year-old girl as she walked to school, essayed her and then strangled her to death, then made phone calls to police to give clues to where her body could be found. 3 years before, he essayed a 14-year-old girl. Ronald Deere, 42 years on death row. Despondent over a breakup, Deere killed his girlfriend's brother and the man's 2 children. Melvin Fort, 42 years on death row. In 1981, he gunned down a German tourist, and a year later he shot a woman and killed her fiancé. He was in prison when the cases were solved 3 decades later, based on DNA found on the ring of the deceased tourist. Philip Lucero, 42 years on death row. He essayed and killed 2 girls, 7 years old and 10 years old, who had walked through his backyard on the way to a park. William Payton, 42 years on death row. Payton essayed and murdered a woman at the boarding house where he had lived with his wife, and attempted to murder another woman and her son with a butcher knife, stabbing them more than 60 times. Craig Ross, 42 years on death row. Ross and Stephen Champion killed a man and his 14-year-old son during the robbery of the victim's home. That evening, they robbed a nearby apartment, essaying a woman inside and killing her brother. Ross was convicted of 3 murders, Champion of 2. Ricardo Sanders, 42 years on death row. During the robbery of a Bob's Big Boy restaurant, Sanders and accomplices killed 4 victims. Keith Adcox, 41 years on death row. Adcox and a friend, camping in the woods without money, killed a fisherman to steal his money and car. Kevin Cooper, 41 years on death row. After escaping from a prison camp, Cooper killed 4 people sleeping in a house in which he was hiding and used a hatchet to dismember some of the bodies. A mother, father, daughter, and a boy from the neighborhood were killed. A son survived having his throat slit. Cooper continues to maintain his innocence. Douglas Mikey, 41 years on death row. Seeking revenge on an old acquaintance, Mikey returned from a military base in Japan and robbed and murdered a man and his 18-year-old girlfriend. Michael Morales, 41 years on death row. To get revenge on the woman who competed with his cousin for the attention of another boy, Morales attempted to strangle her with his belt until it broke. He beat her repeatedly on the head with a hammer, dragged her body to a field and essayed her, and finally stabbed her 4 times in the chest to ensure she was dead. William Proctor, 41 years on death row. Proctor entered the home of a widow living alone, essayed her and tortured her, then put her body in the trunk of a car to dispose of it near a lake. John Visciotti, 41 years on death row. Fired from their jobs at a burglar alarm company, Visciotti and another man robbed 2 other employees on their payday, killing one and shooting the other 3 times. Robert Bloom, 40 years on death row. Bloom shot to death his father, stepmother, and 8-year-old stepsister, whom he also stabbed 23 times in the face with scissors. He pleaded insanity and was allowed to represent himself at trial. Bloom's sentence was overturned, but he was resentenced to death in 2001. Richard Boyer, 40 years on death row. Boyer stabbed 2 elderly people to death during a robbery of their Fullerton home. His first conviction was overturned, but he was condemned again on retrial. David Carpenter, 40 years on death row. Trailside killer Carpenter assaulted hikers on remote paths in Santa Cruz and Marin counties in 1980 and 1981, raping some and shooting 7 to death. Dean Carter, 40 years on death row. Carter killed 4 women in 2 counties. He had a pattern of essaying, robbing, and fatally strangling women whom he previously had befriended. Murder charges in a 5th killing were dismissed. Martin Drews, 40 years on death row. Drews and another parolee from the California Youth Authority stabbed a man to death on New Year's Eve and was in prison for that murder when he killed another inmate. Michael Jackson, 40 years on death row. While high from PCP-laced cigarettes, Jackson shot a police officer responding to a call of a barefoot, disheveled man acting strangely in a neighborhood. Jackson had grabbed the officer's shotgun during the struggle that had ensued. William Kirkpatrick, 40 years on death row. Kirkpatrick killed 2 employees at the Taco Bell where he once worked and robbed the store. Robert Lewis, 40 years on death row. Lewis killed a man, stealing his cash and the Cadillac the man had advertised for sale. Charles McDowell, 40 years on death row. During a midday robbery, McDowell broke into a house and killed the housekeeper who was working at the time. A federal appellate panel in 1997 vacated the death penalty and ordered the case back to state court for retrial. Charles Moore, 40 years on death row. With 2 accomplices, he returned to a Long Beach apartment complex where he once lived and robbed the couple that managed the complex, stabbing them to death during the crime. Scott Penholster, 40 years on death row. He stabbed to death 2 men during a 1982 drug robbery. His lawyer claimed childhood brain injuries left him unstable and he was institutionalized at a psychiatric hospital as a child. The Ninth Circuit overturned his death sentence, but a divided U.S. Supreme Court reinstated it in 2011, saying federal judges had overstepped their bounds in second-guessing the state court. Mark Riley, 40 years on death row. Riley and accomplice James Hardy were condemned for stabbing to death a woman and her 8-year-old son in Van Nuys in 1983 at the request of the husband, who sought to collect on a life insurance policy. Hardy's conviction was later overturned. Gerald Stanley, 40 years on death row. Stanley, a professional hunting guide, killed his second wife. 15 years later, he stalked and killed his third wife, burning down her house and her car and tracking her to a resort where he shot her with a high-powered rifle. Andre Burton, 39 years on death row. Burton robbed 2 women and stole their truck. He used the vehicle to drive to another location where he shot a man in the face twice to steal a bag of coins and then shot and killed the man's mother. Michael Cox, 39 years on death row. Cox, a convalescent care worker who slept in his car, killed 3 teen girls he knew from a Placerville foster home and dumped their naked bodies in the El Dorado National Forest. Raynard Cummings, 39 years on death row. Following a string of robberies, Cummings and partner Kenneth Gay killed a Los Angeles police officer after he pulled over a stolen car in which the men were passengers. Both men had been on parole for previous crimes. Jack Farnham, 39 years on death row. During a home robbery, Farnham essayed and sodomized a woman who had been alone in the house, then he killed her. Patrick Gordon, 39 years on death row. Gordon was the getaway driver for 2 armored car heists at Kmart stores in Riverside and Stockton, in which his brothers shot and killed the couriers. Dwayne Holloway, 39 years on death row. Holloway killed 2 sisters during a robbery of their townhouse. Brian Mincy, 39 years on death row. Mincy killed the 5-year-old son of his girlfriend. Police reported repeated calls of violence at the house, and the beaten body of the boy had more than 100 injuries. The boy's 4-year-old sister also showed signs of beatings. Richard Ramirez, 39 years on death row. Ramirez sodomized and stabbed to death a 22-year-old woman he met at a dance club. Stephen Catlin, 38 years on death row. Catlin killed his mother and 2 of his ex-wives, poisoning them with paraquat to collect life insurance proceeds and his inheritance. Tiaquan Cox, 38 years on death row. Cox was a street gang member on parole when he and accomplices sought to carry out a contract killing. The killers went to the wrong address and executed NFL football player Kermit Alexander's mother, sister, and 2 nephews. On death row, cops stabbed another condemned inmate, and he was part of a 2000 escape attempt. Alexander is one of the most prominent voices behind Proposition 66, which would speed the appeals process and allow faster executions. John Dunkel, 38 years on death row. Dunkel, also known as the Peninsula serial killer, is a serial killer who murdered 3 young boys in Belmont, California between 1981 and 1985. Horace Kelly, 38 years on death row. Kelly killed an 11-year-old boy in Riverside who sought to prevent him from abducting his cousin as they walked home from a corner store on Thanksgiving. A week earlier, he killed 2 women and essayed the bodies in San Bernardino County. Denny Mickle, 38 years on death row. After Mickle moved in with a family living in a motel room, He stabbed their 12-year-old daughter to death and then set the room on fire. James Scott, 38 years on death row. Scott assaulted and essayed a woman in her home, then set her on fire. While she lived, he pleaded guilty to her essay and attempted murder. She later died of burn complications. Mauricio Silva, 38 years on death row. Within 3 weeks after being paroled from prison after serving time for murder, Silva killed 3 more people, including a 16-year-old boy he met on the road and a hitchhiker he picked up. David Brooks, 37 years on death row. A heroin addict who sold guns and drugs, he abducted and killed a woman to take her car during a string of robberies. Robert Fairbanks, 37 years on death row. A week after essaying one woman, Fairbanks tortured and killed a second woman in his apartment, then dumped her in the woods and set her body on fire. He became a suspect after police responded to a report by his physically abused girlfriend. Keith Fudge, 37 years on death row. During a fight between LA street gangs, Fudge and accomplices drove up to a house party and began firing, killing 5 people and injuring 5 others. Willie Johnson, 37 years on death row. Johnson and another man invaded the home of a drug dealer's girlfriend and shot the woman and her mother. The mother died. Brian Jones, 37 years on death row. Jones killed 2 women and essayed or attempted to kill 3 more. He was charged but not convicted of similarly killing 2 other women. Martin Kipp, 37 years on death row. Kipp essayed, robbed, and murdered 2 young women, including a college student who had just arrived in Long Beach. Stephen Livaditis, 37 years on death row. He killed 2 hostages during a Beverly Hills jewelry store robbery. A 3rd hostage died in police crossfire. Mitchell Sims, 37 years on death row. Sims and a partner killed a pizza delivery man, stole his uniform, and then robbed the pizza restaurant where he worked, locking employees in a locker. Paul Tuilaepa, 37 years on death row. In 1986, he shot 4 men during a robbery of patrons at a crowded Long Beach bar, killing 1. He has been in isolation since 2006 for assaulting officers. Conrad Zappian, 37 years on death row. Zappian was convicted of killing a woman who was having an affair with his sister's husband. Max Barney, 36 years on death row. He fought for a year with a former gold dredging partner he accused of stealing from him. A year later, he and others confronted the former partner at a gold camp and shot, beat, and tortured him before stabbing him to death. Joseph Barrett, 20 years on death row. Barrett stabbed his prison cellmate to death. He was serving a life sentence for beating a man to death with a barbell when he was 16. Rodney Berryman, 36 years on death row. He stabbed a 17-year-old girl to death during an essay. Kenneth Bivert, 36 years on death row. A prison gang leader serving a life sentence for killing 3 people in incidents 2 days apart who were fishing along a Sacramento riverbank when he was 17, he stabbed to death an inmate who refused his orders to attack another inmate. Tracy Kane, 36 years on death row. Kane robbed and killed an elderly couple who lived next door to his father's house. William Dennis, 36 years on death row. After the drowning death of his 3-year-old son, Dennis dressed in a Halloween werewolf costume to kill his pregnant ex-wife. Curtis Fauber, 36 years on death row. He killed a man with the blunt side of an axe while robbing his house of cocaine and drug money. Jerry Fry, 36 years on death row. Camped on a gold mining claim in order to cultivate Mary Jane, Fry killed an elderly couple living in a cabin nearby in order to steal their cash. Kevin Halley, 36 years on death row. He broke into a woman's apartment and essayed and killed her. Arthur Halverson, 36 years on death row. Halverson, a self-employed contractor with bipolar disorder, shot 4 men in 3 separate incidents, killing 2 and wounding 2 others, including a former professional football player who tackled him and cut his throat with broken glass. William Hart, 36 years on death row. Hart convinced 2 teen girls to accompany him to a remote area, essaying both of them and killing 1. He drove the second girl back to town after she convinced him she would not tell. Michael Hill, 36 years on death row. Hill killed a man and his 4-year-old son during a robbery of an Oakland jewelry store. Gary Hines, 36 years on death row. He killed a woman and her 15-year-old daughter in order to steal the family's pink Model T Roadster replica. Laverne Johnson, 36 years on death row. Johnson beat a woman to death and strangled her daughter with wire, then set their house on fire. He had been dating the daughter and went to their house for dinner when he robbed the woman of their gold jewelry and killed them. He had 4 prior convictions for robbery and burglary, as well as cases that never went to trial for offenses including essays. Lance Osband, 36 years on death row. Osband used a knife to kill a 66-year-old woman during the robbery of her apartment. David Raleigh, 36 years on death row. A security guard at a mansion, Raleigh locked 2 teen girls into a basement safe, forced them to strip, beat and stabbed them, held them hostage in the trunk of his car, and eventually dumped them. After their rescue, one died from 41 stab wounds. Charles Real, 36 years on death row. Real robbed a night shift worker at a truck stop along Interstate 5, drove the victim to another county, and then killed him. David Rogers, 36 years on death row. In shootings a year apart, Rogers killed 2 Bakersfield prostitutes. Guy Rowland, 36 years on death row. He essayed and killed a woman he met at a bar. Teddy Sanchez, 36 years on death row. Sanchez killed a 72-year-old man confined to a wheelchair and days later murdered a married couple. Hector Ayala, 35 years on death row. Ayala and his brother were convicted of triple homicide in 1988 for killing 3 men and wounding a 4th during an attempted robbery of a San Diego auto body shop being used as a distribution point for heroin. Ronaldo Ayala, 35 years on death row. Mexican mafia associates Ayala and his brother Hector killed 3 people and shot a 4th at a San Diego auto body shop used to distribute heroin. Rodney Beeler, 35 years on death row. Beeler shot to death a man who unwittingly walked in on the robbery of his home. Herbert Coddington, 35 years on death row. He posed as a filmmaker and called a modeling agency to send 2 girls to his trailer home. He essayed the girls, 12 years old and 14 years old, and killed the 2 elderly men, 69 and 73, who had been their chaperones. Albert Cunningham, 35 years on death row. Cunningham killed 2 men he met at a bar after following them to the parking lot and demanding their money. Gregory Demetrulias, 35 years on death row. He stabbed a man to death in his boarding house room to rob him after the victim was seen at a local diner with several $100s in cash. Randy Kraft, 35 years on death row. Kraft killed 16 young men between 1972 and 1983, mutilating some of them and leaving their bodies by the roadside. 6 of the men were Marines. Most of the victims had been drugged with alcohol and prescription relaxants. Kraft was discovered when he was pulled over for drunk driving, and officers found a dead man in the passenger seat. David Lucas, 35 years on death row. He was believed to have killed 5 women and a young boy and slashed the throat of a 7th victim in attacks from 1979 to 1984. He was convicted of 3 of the murders and attempted murder in a 4th case. James Marlowe, 35 years on death row. Kaufman and James Marlowe abducted a woman after she left work in an insurance office and held her captive while Marlowe sodomized her until they obtained her banking information, then strangled her and dumped her body in a field. 5 days later, Marlowe and Kaufman assaulted and killed a 19-year-old woman from the dry cleaning shop where she worked in Orange County. In addition, Marlowe was charged in the 1986 murder-for-hire killing of a man in Kentucky. Robert Morey, 35 years on death row. He killed 3 women and raped the 4th, then called the Shasta County Crime Investigation Line to seek money for tips and where the bodies were located. Manuel Mendoza, 35 years on death row. After a string of robberies to support his cocaine habit and while on the run from police, Mendoza tied a woman to her bed, robbed her, then set her house on fire. She died of severe burns. Lester Ochoa, 35 years on death row. Ochoa kidnapped, essayed, and stabbed to death a 16-year-old girl, leaving her body on the grounds of a school. He previously robbed and assaulted 2 other women. David Rundle, 35 years on death row. Rundle, with a history of sexual abuse and assaults, attacked 3 young women, binding their hands behind their backs, killing them, and leaving their bodies in the woods. Andre Alexander, 34 years on death row. Alexander and another man attempted to rob 2 people who turned out to be Secret Service agents on a stakeout, killing one of the agents in the process. Alexander was charged more than a decade later. Jason Balcom, 34 years on death row. Balcom was in Michigan prison serving a 50-year sentence for essay in 2004 when DNA evidence connected him to the 1988 essay and stabbing death of a 22-year-old woman in Costa Mesa. Mark Bradford, 34 years on death row. Threatened with eviction for failing to pay rent, Bradford essayed and sodomized the new manager of his apartment complex, then returned and slit her throat. Tracy Carter, 34 years on death row. Carter and 2 others robbed a couple whose church bus had broken down, killing the man. Shortly after, they killed another man in a liquor store parking lot. Mark Crew, 34 years on death row. In order to kill a former girlfriend whose money he sought, Crew married her to convince her to take a cross-country trip during which he shot her in the head. The body was never found. Joseph Danks, 34 years on death row. Danks, known as the Koreatown Slasher, was sentenced to 156 years in prison for killing 6 homeless people in Los Angeles. He received the death penalty when he was condemned after he strangled his first prison cellmate to death. John Holt, 34 years on death row. Holt was working as a door-to-door salesman of cleaning products when he entered the home of a Bakersfield woman and killed her. Chris Hughes, 34 years on death row. Sent home from his construction job because he was high on drugs, Hughes essayed and murdered a woman who lived in an apartment upstairs from him. Richard Lettner, 34 years on death row. Lettner and crime partner Christopher Tobin killed a 59-year-old woman, slitting her throat and severing her spine during a robbery of her home. Milton Lewis, 34 years on death row. Lewis killed his drug supplier, then robbed him, giving part of the money to a girlfriend who spent it on meth. Maureen McDermott, 34 years on death row. McDermott hired 3 men to kill the man she lived with so she could inherit the house and collect on a $100,000 life insurance policy. Kurt Michaels, 34 years on death row. After psychiatric discharge from the Marines, Michaels killed the mother of his 16-year-old girlfriend during a robbery of her house. Evan Nakahara, 34 years on death row. At 19 years old, he shot a 20-year-old woman he had dated for several years in order to steal her father's gun collection and war memorabilia. His accomplice, Michael Rojas, was tried separately and sentenced to 7 years for robbery and being an accessory to murder. Ramon Salcido, 34 years on death row. In a 3-hour period, Salcido drove his 3 daughters to a gulch and slit their throats, drove to his mother-in-law's house where he stabbed her and her 2 daughters, returned home and shot his wife, and then drove to the vineyard where he worked and shot 2 supervisors. 7 of the 9 victims died. Mark Schmeck, 34 years on death row. Schmeck killed a man who had advertised to sell his motorhome. Christopher Tobin, 34 years on death row. Tobin and crime partner Richard Lettner killed a 59-year-old woman, slitting her throat and severing her spine during a robbery of her home. Paul Bolin, 33 years on death row. Bolin shot and killed his partner for bringing strangers to the area where they were growing Mary Jane in Kern County. Bolin shot the visitors as well, killing one and wounding the other. Christopher Box, 33 years on death row. Box and Manuel Flores Jr. killed a woman, her 3-year-old son, and a house guest during a robbery, and they attempted to kill a 4th person. Stephen Brown, 33 years on death row. Brown and another condemned man, Charles Keith Richardson, essayed and murdered an 11-year-old girl, drowning her in a bathtub. Delano Cleveland, 33 years on death row. Cleveland and 2 others sentenced to death row, Chauncey Veasley and Rajesh Sharan, shot to death and robbed 2 drug dealers at a Pomona motel. The sentence for Sharan, who had no prior felonies, was converted to life without parole. Ronnie Dement, 33 years on death row. He killed his county jail cellmate while attempting to force him to have relations. Curtis Irwin, 33 years on death row. In a contract killing, Irwin and an accomplice kidnapped the ex-wife of their client and stabbed her to death. Ronald Jones, 33 years on death row. Jones and a partner abducted a woman at a Pasadena shopping mall, repeatedly essayed her, then shot her in the head and dumped her body on the side of the road. Raymond Lewis, 33 years on death row. Lewis did drugs with a woman before strangling and beating her to death with a board to steal her money. James O'Malley, 33 years on death row. O'Malley stabbed and shot to death the wife of a fellow motorcycle gang member to prevent her from getting a divorce settlement. He killed a man who wanted to join the gang in order to steal his motorcycle and murdered a friend who he thought was an informant. John Sapp, 33 years on death row. After his arrest for possession of a firearm, Sapp confessed to 3 unsolved murders over a 10-year period, including that of his girlfriend and what he said was a contract killing. He confessed to a 4th killing and 2 attempted murders for which he was not charged. Michael Slaughter, 33 years on death row. Slaughter killed 3 men who sought to buy $45,000 of cocaine from him. Tauno Waidla, 33 years on death row. Waidla and Peter Zacharias killed an American-Estonian civic leader who had taken them in after their flight from Estonia, strangling her and bludgeoning her with a hatchet. Zacharias also was condemned, but the state Supreme Court overturned his death sentence in 2005. Rosie Maria Alfaro, 32 years on death row. Alfaro stabbed to death the 9-year-old sister of a friend during a robbery of the girl's house. James Beck, 32 years on death row. Cult leader Gerald Cruz used sleep deprivation and occult beliefs to manipulate followers into murdering 4 people in attacks with baseball bats and knives. Beck and Ricky Vieira were condemned to death while 2 others received life sentences. Andrew Brown, 32 years on death row. Brown shot a woman driving a customized red truck in order to steal the vehicle's specialty tire rims. Jose Casares, 32 years on death row. Casares shot and stabbed 2 men during a cocaine deal, killing one of them. Cynthia Kaufman, 32 years on death row. Kaufman and James Marlowe abducted a woman after she left work in an insurance office and held her captive while Marlowe sodomized her until they obtained her banking information, then strangled her and dumped her body in a field. 5 days later, Marlowe and Kaufman assaulted and killed a 19-year-old woman from the dry cleaning shop where she worked in Orange County. Marlowe was also charged with the 1986 murder-for-hire killing of a man in Kentucky. Stephen Cole, 32 years on death row. After his battered girlfriend threatened to leave, Cole poured gasoline on her and lit her on fire, also setting fire to the house they rented. She was rescued but died of burns 5 days later. Gerald Cruz, 32 years on death row. He was a cult leader who manipulated his followers into murdering 4 people in attacks with baseball bats and knives. Kerry Dalton, 32 years on death row. Dalton, a meth addict, and 2 accomplices beat and tortured to death a woman she believed had stolen her jewelry, injecting her with battery acid and electrocuting her before dismembering and disposing of the body. The victim was never found. Ricky Earp, 32 years on death row. Earp essayed and killed an 18-month-old child left in his care. Marchand Elliott, 32 years on death row. In a series of armored car robberies, Elliott killed one of the drivers. Richard Farley, 32 years on death row. Farley went to the factory where he had been fired 2 years before and killed 7 people and wounded 4 others. Jack Friend, 32 years on death row. Friend stabbed a bartender to death to steal his cash. Danny Hillhouse, 32 years on death row. Hillhouse and his brother drove their victim, who earlier had bought them a beer with a $100 bill, to a location near Chico where they stabbed him to death and then stole his truck. Alfonso Howard, 32 years on death row. Howard was condemned for the essay and shooting death of an 11-year-old girl who lived in his neighborhood. Daniel Landry, 32 years on death row. A member of a white supremacist prison gang, Landry stabbed another inmate to death. Franklin Lynch, 32 years on death row. He beat and robbed 5 elderly women in their homes over a 3-month period. 3 of the victims died. Sergio Ochoa, 32 years on death row. During a series of retaliation shootings and killings between rival street gangs, Ochoa killed a man he mistook for a gang member and shot another man to death to steal his Trans Am. Rudolph Roybal, 32 years on death row. Roybal returned to the home of an elderly couple for whom he had done yard work and killed the wife during a nighttime robbery while the husband was at work. Rodney San Nicholas, 32 years on death row. Following arguments about his lack of a job after release from prison, San Nicholas killed his wife and essayed and killed his 9-year-old niece. Christopher Satie White, 32 years on death row. Satie White and 2 friends kidnapped and essayed a woman in their car. He then shot her to prevent her from identifying her abductors, leaving her body in a ditch. Gregory Smith, 32 years on death row. After being fired as a teacher's aide for inappropriate behavior with children, Smith sought retaliation by killing an 8-year-old boy and leaving his body in the woods where he started a fire. Morris Solomon, 32 years on death row. Sacramento police found the bodies of 7 prostitutes, all but one at homes where Solomon had stayed or worked. He was convicted of 6 of the deaths, as well as the essay of 2 other women. DeAndre Staten, 32 years on death row. Staten shot his father and stabbed his mother to death to collect their $300,000 in life insurance policies. Robert Taylor, 32 years on death row. Taylor and 2 accomplices targeted a couple who had advertised the car for sale. He shot both, killing the woman and leaving her husband a quadriplegic. Richard Tully, 32 years on death row. Tully broke into the house of a 59-year-old nurse, essayed her, and stabbed her 23 times, killing her. Chauncey Veasley, 32 years on death row. He and 2 other men shot to death and robbed 2 drug dealers in a Pomona motel room. All 3 received death sentences. Richard Vieira, 32 years on death row. Cult leader Gerald Cruz used sleep deprivation and occult beliefs to manipulate followers into murdering 4 people in attacks with baseball bats and knives. James Beck and Ricky Vieira were condemned to death while 2 others received life sentences. Billy Walden, 32 years on death row. Walden, a 40-year-old former Navy enlisted man, killed a woman, her daughter, and a man, and committed 21 other crimes, including essay, in 1985. George Williams, 32 years on death row. Williams shot 2 people during a robbery that had started as a drug deal. Maurice Boyette, 31 years on death row. Boyette, 19 and homeless, shot and killed 2 people who owed a drug debt to the man who had taken him in. Eric Chapman, 31 years on death row. During the robbery of a drive-up photo booth, Chapman stabbed the clerk 51 times, killing her. Michael Combs, 31 years on death row. Combs and an accomplice convinced a woman to drive them to Calico Ghost Town, then killed her to take her car and money. Robert Curl, 31 years on death row. After his release from prison for crimes including the murder of another inmate, Curl killed a man over a drug debt. Richard De Hoyos, 31 years on death row. De Hoyos kidnapped a 9-year-old girl walking home from school, essayed her, and then killed her. The first verdict was thrown out because of juror misconduct, and De Hoyos was convicted on retrial. James Hurd, 31 years on death row. Hurd essayed and killed the daughter of the woman he lived with. Hurd's sentence was overturned in 2003 because of jury selection errors, but he was condemned again in 2010. Eric Houston, 31 years on death row. Armed with a shotgun and a rifle, Houston went to the high school where he had failed to graduate and killed 4 people, wounding others and holding 80 students hostage for 8 hours until surrendering. Jerry Kennedy, 31 years on death row. Kennedy robbed and shot a man to death in a rest stop bathroom along Interstate 5. Albert Lewis, 31 years on death row. In a campaign to terrorize his ex-wife, Lewis and his half-brother Anthony Cedric Oliver took hoods and took shotguns to storm a Los Angeles church where they shot the woman's family, killing 2 and wounding a 3rd. John Lewis, 31 years on death row. During a 2-month string of crimes in Los Angeles, Lewis and 3 partners robbed and attacked 8 people, killing 5 of them. Christopher Lightsey, 31 years on death row. Lightsey killed a 76-year-old man who lived alone in Bakersfield to steal guns from the man's collection. Omar Martinez, 31 years on death row. Martinez shot at 2 men who had filed a labor complaint after not being paid for work they did for him. One of the men was killed. Johnny Miles, 31 years on death row. A serial rapist, Miles was accused of assailing and robbing at least 6 women. He killed one who worked as a rape counselor. Christian Monterroso, 31 years on death row. In back-to-back robberies, Monterroso shot to death a clerk at a gas station and a clerk at a liquor store. Anthony Oliver, 31 years on death row. Oliver joined his half-brother Albert Lewis in a campaign to terrorize Lewis' ex-wife. They shot the woman's family, killing 2 and wounding a 3rd. Cleophas Prince, 31 years on death row. After his court-martial by the Navy, Prince killed 6 women over the course of a year, stalking some of the victims. Ricardo Roldan, 31 years on death row. Roldan and 2 partners robbed a swap meet manager. During a pursuit by swap meet employees who cornered the robbers, Roldan shot and killed one of the employees. Robert Smith, 31 years on death row. Smith shot to death his former lover and his lover's brother in order to rob their apartment. Charles Stevens, 31 years on death row. Over 5 months in 1989, Stevens randomly shot motorists on Interstate 580, killing 4 and attempting to kill 6 others. Gregory Tate, 31 years on death row. Tate stabbed a woman 50 times and cut off her finger to take her wedding ring during a home robbery. Keon Wallace, 31 years on death row. Wallace attempted to assay and rob an 83-year-old woman who died 2 days later of brain injury. Latwan Weaver, 31 years on death row. Weaver killed the owner of a jewelry store during a robbery of the business. Enrique Zambrano, 31 years on death row. Zambrano, a member of the Berkeley Waterfront Commission, bludgeoned the university professor and his wife because he believed they had made anonymous calls exposing his extramarital affair. He then fatally shot another waterfront commissioner to prevent him from testifying about the attack on the couple. Stephen Bell, 30 years on death row. Bell stabbed to death the 11-year-old son of the woman he was living with so he could steal her television and sell it for money to buy crack cocaine. Sean Burney, 30 years on death row. Burney and 2 other gang members robbed the man, shoved him into the trunk of his car, then conducted several drive-by shootings before stopping, opening the trunk, and killing the victim. Celeste Carrington, 30 years on death row. During a string of robberies at businesses where she had worked as a janitor, Carrington killed 2 night workers and shot a physician working late. Joseph Cook, 30 years on death row. Cook was doing yard work for an elderly couple when he beat them to death on their wedding anniversary. Thomas Cruz, 30 years on death row. Cruz killed a Shasta County Sheriff's deputy with the deputy's gun after he was arrested for public drinking and was being transported to the county jail. Anthony Delgado, 30 years on death row. Delgado killed 2 cellmates at Corcoran State Prison. Tim the Priest, 30 years on death row. On parole from prison, the priest shot a woman and stole her car to drive to Missouri. Jaime Hoyos, 30 years on death row. Hoyos invaded the home of a large-scale Mary Jane distributor, killing the man and his wife and wounding their child. Brian Johnson, 30 years on death row. Johnson attacked an elderly couple in their home, bludgeoning and stabbing the 74-year-old woman to death. Robert Jurado, 30 years on death row. Jurado, with the help of 2 women, beat and strangled a female acquaintance to death after an argument in their van while they were planning to kill their drug supplier. Delaney Marks, 30 years on death row. In a series of seemingly random shootings, Marks shot 4 people at an Oakland Taco Bell, a liquor store, and then in a taxi, killing 2 and leaving 1 victim brain damaged. Milton Pollock, 30 years on death row. Pollock stabbed to death an elderly couple during a robbery to steal money for crack cocaine. Carl Powell, 30 years on death row. Powell killed the manager of the Kentucky Fried Chicken store where he worked. Anthony Bankston, 29 years on death row. Bankston killed a man during a robbery in Los Angeles. Stephen Bonilla, 29 years on death row. After a falling out with his nightclub business partner, Bonilla recruited 2 men to abduct and kill him. Stanley Bryant, 29 years on death row. Gang members Bryant, Donald Smith, and Leroy Wheeler fatally shot 4 people, including a 2-year-old toddler, in a drug-related dispute with 2 of the victims. Royal Clark, 29 years on death row. Clark attempted to essay and then murdered the 14-year-old cousin of his girlfriend and kidnapped and attempted to strangle her 15-year-old friend. Glenn Cornwell, 29 years on death row. Cornwell, with a history of armed robberies, fatally shot a Sacramento man who was entering a check-cashing business with a briefcase of cash. Ernest Dykes, 29 years on death row. Dykes robbed the elderly woman who managed the apartments where he lived and killed her grandson. Randy Garcia, 29 years on death row. During back-to-back home invasion robberies, Garcia shot and killed a man and attempted to essay his wife. Jonathan George, 29 years on death row. George escaped from custody while being transported between the San Diego jail and the courthouse and killed a man while stealing his car. Danny Horning, 29 years on death row. Horning killed a man known to keep large amounts of cash in his home, then dismembered the body before dumping it in the San Joaquin River Delta. Ernest Jones, 29 years on death row. Jones essayed and killed the mother of his girlfriend and used the woman's jewelry to buy cocaine. Douglas Kelly, 29 years on death row. Kelly essayed and tortured several women he had conned. He stabbed a 19-year-old girl to death with scissors and left her nude body beneath the bed of a 10-year-old son of a woman he had lived with. Keith Loker, 29 years on death row. Loker killed 2 people during the robbery of an adult bookstore and wounded the cashier. Human Panna, 29 years on death row. Panna essayed and killed a 12-year-old girl visiting her father in the apartment complex where he lived. Charles Roundtree, 29 years on death row. Roundtree and his girlfriend, Mary Elizabeth Stroder, kidnapped a 19-year-old woman from a Bakersfield shopping mall, robbed her, drove her to a remote location, and shot her to death. Edgardo Sanchez Fuentes, 29 years on death row. Sanchez Fuentes and accomplices committed 7 takeover-style armed robberies of Los Angeles area businesses from December 1991 to May 1992. During one robbery, Sanchez Fuentes and his partner shot the store owner to death. During another robbery, Sanchez Fuentes used a stun gun to coerce victims to unlock a safe. In the final robbery, he shot to death a police officer responding to a silent alarm. William Suff, 29 years on death row. Suff killed 12 women and attempted to kill a 13th over a 2-year period. He strangled his victims, most of whom were prostitutes, and gave some of their possessions to female friends. Ignacio Tafoya, 29 years on death row. Tafoya shot 2 men to death during a drug-related robbery. Regis Thomas, 29 years on death row. Thomas killed a man after an argument over mistaken identity and later shot to death 2 Compton police officers who had stopped him on the road. Mark Thornton, 29 years on death row. Thornton, then 19, abducted a woman from a parking lot, killing her and stealing her car, which he then used to abduct his 16-year-old former girlfriend. She escaped at a casino in Nevada. Randall Wall, 29 years on death row. Wall killed an elderly man and his partially blind wife. Wall once lived with the couple's granddaughter in the house. Leroy Wheeler, 29 years on death row. Gang members Wheeler, Stanley Bryant, and Donald Smith fatally shot 4 people, including a 2-year-old toddler, in a drug-related dispute with 2 of the victims. Joseph Aguayo, 28 years on death row. Aguayo was already in prison for the attempted murder of a woman when a DNA match linked him with the 1979 essay and killing of a pregnant woman. Lamar Barnwell, 28 years on death row. Barnwell killed 4 people in one night, including 2 men shot in the head while they were kneeling. That killing was witnessed by a police officer responding to a woman's screams. Barnwell's other victims, a man and woman, also were shot in the head. He was convicted of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. Raymond Butler, 28 years on death row. Butler killed 2 college students and, while in jail awaiting trial on the case, he stabbed another inmate to death. Charles Case, 28 years on death row. Case, on early parole after being convicted of essaying 5 women, killed the owner of a bar and the customer as he forced them to kneel in the bathroom. Robert Cohen, 28 years on death row. 10 years after the murder of an elderly Kern County couple during the robbery of their home, a recheck of crime scene fingerprints implicated Cohen. He was also charged but not convicted of the robbery and murder of another man found dead at home 3 days after the first slayings. Cohen's brother, a participant in the first murder, pleaded guilty to lesser charges. John Cunningham, 28 years on death row. During the robbery of an office furniture store, Cunningham bound 3 employees and then shot each in the head, setting the building on fire as he fled. Rick Davis, 28 years on death row. In 1986, Davis kidnapped, essayed, and killed 12-year-old Polly Klaas. Davis had a long history of convictions for assault, burglary, kidnapping, and robbery. The murder led to passage of California's 3 strikes law. Keith Doolin, 28 years on death row. Doolin murdered 2 Fresno prostitutes and attempted to kill 4 others. Dennis Irvin, 28 years on death row. Irvin killed a Lassen County Sheriff's deputy responding to a report of domestic violence. Richard Foster, 28 years on death row. Foster had a pattern of finding women alone and then returning to rob them. He fatally stabbed a woman working in the minister's office of a church. Freddie Fuyava, 28 years on death row. Fuyava killed a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy in an exchange of gunfire during a gang sweep of the community. Richard Gamache, 28 years on death row. After discharge from the army, Gamache, his wife, and an accomplice abducted the couple to steal their horses and trailer. They took the couple to the desert where Gamache shot both. The man died, but his wife survived. Albert Jones, 28 years on death row. Jones had served 3 prison sentences when he and a 15-year-old accomplice hogtied and stabbed to death an elderly Riverside County couple during a robbery. Eric Leonard, 28 years on death row. Leonard killed 6 people during a string of robberies in Sacramento, including at a pizza restaurant and a convenience store. Darrell Lomax, 28 years on death row. Lomax killed a store clerk during a robbery. Edward Morgan, 28 years on death row. Morgan attacked a woman he met at a club, rammed sharp objects into her private parts, beat her head against concrete, and strangled her to death. Michael Pearson, 28 years on death row. After being fired from his job as a receptionist at the Richmond Housing Authority, Pearson returned and shot and killed 2 former co-workers. Clifton Perry, 28 years on death row. Perry and a partner were convicted of murder for the 1995 shooting death of a store clerk during the robbery of a convenience store in Kings County. His accomplice was sentenced to life without parole. Jerry Rodriguez, 28 years on death row. The owner of a Visalia tire shop, Rodriguez recruited a gunman to kill 2 cousins after they gave him $2,000 to order special rims and tires for their car. Christopher Self, 28 years on death row. Self and Orlando Romero, in a 2-month string of crimes, killed 3 people and wounded 3 others as they stole cars and money. Christopher Spencer, 28 years on death row. Spencer was among a gang of men who stabbed and tortured the craft store owner to death. 2 of the 5 men had worked for the store owner and been fired. Keith Taylor, 28 years on death row. Taylor stabbed and strangled to death a woman whose home he burglarized. James Thompson, 28 years on death row. Thompson, who had served prison time in Texas for murder, and an accomplice, took a 25-year-old mentally disabled man to a remote Riverside area. He forced him to disrobe, robbed him, and shot him to death. Alfredo Valencia, 28 years on death row. Valencia, using meth, stabbed to death another man while in his car. Michael Walters, 28 years on death row. In a Corcoran prison for a prior murder, Walters killed his cellmate, stabbing him 170 times. In 1995, as a 19-year-old gang member, he fired a shotgun at people leaving a party, killing one and wounding two others. Daniel Whelan, 28 years on death row. Whelan and two accomplices gained entry to a house under the pretense that their car had broken down, then shot a man who was watching the property. Michael Wisenhunt, 28 years on death row. Wisenhunt was found guilty in the death of his girlfriend's 19-month-old daughter, who suffered severe internal injuries and third-degree burns. Bob Williams, 28 years on death row. Williams broke into a woman's house and stole her credit cards. Fearing he would be discovered, he returned the next day and returned the cards, but then essayed and killed her. Dexter Williams, 28 years on death row. After assaulting and robbing several men that Williams and accomplices lured on the pretext of sex, Williams attacked and killed a man who had stopped for sex with a prostitute. Frank Becerra, 27 years on death row. Becerra, a drug dealer and gang member, was convicted of strangling to death two men over missing cocaine and injuring a third. The California Supreme Court in June 2016 reversed the conviction, contending Becerra had been refused his right to represent himself. Eric Bennett, 27 years on death row. Bennett essayed and robbed a woman living next door to him, and then killed another woman who had hired him to install flooring. Michael Bramett, 27 years on death row. Bramett shot and killed a man while attempting to rob him in his car. He told authorities he only meant to wound the victim. George Contreras, 27 years on death row. Contreras robbed and murdered a store owner. Jonathan Darcy, 27 years on death row. Darcy was working as a janitor when, mistakenly believing he had been shorted in his paycheck by a contract cleaning service, he doused the bookkeeper with gasoline and set her on fire, killing her. John Famularo, 27 years on death row. Famularo was convicted of kidnapping, sodomizing, and murdering a woman who went missing after attending a concert. Her body was found 3 years later in a freezer, stashed in the back of a stolen truck. Carl Holmes, 27 years on death row. Gang members Holmes, Herbert McLean, and Lorenzo Newborn shot 3 teen boys to death on Halloween in Pasadena. Gunnar Lindbergh, 27 years on death row. Lindbergh, a white supremacist with a criminal history of robbery and assault, stabbed to death an Asian man who was rollerblading at a high school tennis court. Kendrick Lute, 27 years on death row. Lute killed 3 people, while accomplice Bruce Millsap killed 8 in a string of savage armored car holdups in Los Angeles in the 1990s. Bobby Lopez, 27 years on death row. Lopez and 2 other members of Nuestra Familia killed 7 other gang members for failing to pay a portion of drug sales to gang members in prison and for other infractions. Michael Martinez, 27 years on death row. Martinez at night entered the home of an acquaintance and essayed her 10-year-old daughter. When the mother returned home, he struck her on the head with a hammer and stabbed her to death with a kitchen knife. Jean McCurdy, 27 years on death row. McCurdy abducted an 8-year-old girl as she walked to a neighborhood market, killed her, and dumped her body in a creek. Herbert McLean, 27 years on death row. Gang members McLean, Carl Holmes, and Lorenzo Newborn shot 3 teen boys to death on Halloween in Pasadena. Ronald Mendoza, 27 years on death row. A street gang member on parole from the California Youth Authority, Mendoza killed a Pomona police officer who approached him for questioning as Mendoza and friends walked down a railroad track at night. Jeffrey Mills, 27 years on death row. Mills essayed and slit the throat of a woman he encountered walking along the side of an empty road late at night. She had gotten out of her own vehicle after an argument with her boyfriend. Joseph Montez, 27 years on death row. Montez and 3 others robbed and carjacked a 16-year-old boy, held him in the trunk while they drove to a party, and they shot him as he attempted to leave. Lorenzo Newborn, 27 years on death row. Gang members Newborn, Carl Holmes, and Herbert McLean shot 3 teen boys to death on Halloween in Pasadena. Ramon Rogers, 27 years on death row. Over 3 years, Rogers killed his apartment roommates, including his best friend and a woman with whom he had fathered children. Parts of 2 of the victims' bodies were found in various places, including a storage area beneath his apartment. Robert Scully, 27 years on death row. When he was released from Pelican Bay State Prison, Scully had orders from the Aryan Brotherhood to raise money from robberies. The next day, he killed a sheriff's deputy while he was scoping out a potential target. Daniel Silveria, 27 years on death row. Silveria and accomplice John Travis returned to the craft store where they had been fired, bound the owner to a chair with duct tape, then stabbed him 32 times and shocked him with a stun gun before stealing $8,000 from a store safe. A security camera captured the entire incident. Floyd Smith, 27 years on death row. Smith and accomplices killed an 18-year-old former high school football player. Smith pleaded guilty to shooting someone in a 1984 bank robbery. Brandon Taylor, 27 years on death row. Taylor essayed and killed an 80-year-old woman during the robbery of her house. John Travis, 27 years on death row. Again, Travis and accomplice Daniel Silveria robbed and killed their former boss. James Trujeke, 27 years on death row. Trujeke and 2 other members of Nuestra Familia killed 7 gang members for failing to pay a portion of drug sales to gang members in prison and for other infractions. Richard Valdez, 27 years on death row. Valdez followed orders from the Mexican mafia to kill a former gang member and killed the man's family as well, including a 5-year-old boy and a 6-month-old infant. His partner, Jimmy Palma, also was condemned but was stabbed to death 4 months later on the exercise yard at San Quentin. Sean Vines, 27 years on death row. Vines first robbed the McDonald's where he worked, then robbed another McDonald's and killed an employee during the holdup. Marcus Adams, 26 years on death row. A 6-deuce brim gang member, Adams was already serving life in prison for a Santa Barbara robbery homicide when he was sentenced to death for killing 3 young men in South Los Angeles in 1994 in a gang-related shooting. John Capistrano, 26 years on death row. In 1995, he strangled and cut the wrists of a man whose apartment he robbed, and in a second incident invaded the home of a couple, essaying the woman. In the same month, he invaded 2 more residences and attempted to kill 1 man by cutting his throat and beating his head with a baseball bat. Paul Carassi, 26 years on death row. On Mother's Day, he took his mother and his former girlfriend out to dinner at Universal Studios, then stabbed them to death in the parking garage in front of his 2-year-old son. His girlfriend at the time of the killings participated in the stabbings but was not condemned. William Clark, 26 years on death row. Though Clark shot no one, he was convicted of double murder for the shooting of a woman who walked in on his robbery of a computer store and the killing of a witness who could testify against him. His 2 accomplices, including the shooter, were sentenced to life without parole. Robert Edwards, 26 years on death row. Edwards essayed and strangled to death 2 women in Hawaii and California, including the mother of his girlfriend. Daniel Frederickson, 26 years on death row. Frederickson killed a store manager who refused to turn over cash during a robbery. Ivan Gonzalez, 26 years on death row. Meth addicts Ivan Gonzalez and his wife Veronica were both condemned for the torture and bathtub scalding death of their 3-year-old niece while the child's mother was in drug treatment. John Gonzalez, 26 years on death row. Gonzalez and Michael Solis, members of a street gang, killed a man during the robbery of his store and shot 2 teens to death in retaliation for a gang shooting. Veronica Gonzalez, 26 years on death row. Together with her husband Ivan, she was condemned to death for the murder of their 3-year-old niece. Alfred Gutierrez, 26 years on death row. Gutierrez beat his former girlfriend to death. 10 days later, he drove past a gas station and fired his gun at a group of people, killing 1. Cisco Harch, 26 years on death row. After using drugs, Harch, then 18, went to an orange grove where he found a couple asleep in a truck. He shot and killed both of them. He then killed a girl he had taken to the orange grove for relations. Cedric Johnson, 26 years on death row. Johnson killed a person in Los Angeles in 1996. Michael Johnson, 26 years on death row. Johnson killed a Ventura County Sheriff's deputy who responded to a domestic violence call. Kiongozi Jones, 26 years on death row. In a gang-related shooting in Long Beach, Jones killed 2 men. Michael Lewis, 26 years on death row. Lewis went to the apartment of a woman he had flirted with, essayed her, and slashed her neck, killing her. He had essayed another woman under similar circumstances 4 years earlier. Juan Lopez, 26 years on death row. After his 14-year-old girlfriend pressed criminal charges against him for stabbing and abducting her, Lopez arranged for her to be shot to death by his brother. Luis Maciel, 26 years on death row. Maciel was condemned for taking part in a Mexican mafia conspiracy involving a shooting at a house occupied by a member who had left the gang and people who owed drug debts. 5 people died in the shootings, including 2 children, ages 5 years and 6 months. Tommy Martinez, 26 years on death row. After a series of attempted assaults on women in a shopping area, Martinez attacked and beat a woman to death with a baseball bat. Richard McWhirter, 26 years on death row. McWhirter, being in Las Vegas without money, returned to his neighbor's apartment in Bakersville and broke in to steal $3,000, killing his neighbor and her 10-year-old son during the crime. Martin Mendoza, 26 years on death row. After being reported to authorities for beating and essaying his wife's daughter, Mendoza tracked down his family, put 4 children into a car, and shot them, killing 3. Gerardo Romero, 26 years on death row. Romero killed a rival gang member at a video store and 3 hours later killed another man in rival gang territory. David Scott, 26 years on death row. Scott essayed and killed a woman during a burglary of her apartment. Michael Solis, 26 years on death row. Solis and John Anthony Gonzalez, members of a street gang, killed a man during the robbery of his store and shot 2 teens to death in retaliation for a gang shooting. Keith Thomas, 26 years on death row. Thomas and an accomplice kidnapped a woman from a BART station in Oakland. He essayed and sodomized her before shooting her in the head. Jack Williams, 26 years on death row. Williams induced a group of teenagers to form a gang. Over a week, gang members committed a series of robberies, attempted robberies, kidnappings, carjackings, and the murder of an Air Force nurse whose car they sought to steal. Andre Wilson, 26 years on death row. Wilson killed a woman on her first day of work as a clerk at a market he attempted to rob. Donald Young, 26 years on death row. Brothers Donald and Timothy Young killed 5 people and wounded a 6th during a robbery at a Tulare bar following a pool tournament. Joseph Avila, 25 years on death row. Avila confronted a group of men in Riverside early in the morning and after a brief argument grabbed a knife, fatally stabbed 2 men in the heart, and attempted to kill a 3rd. He was arrested 4 years later at the Los Angeles International Airport. Robert Bacon, 25 years on death row. Bacon, who a decade earlier killed a man in Arizona by slashing his throat with a broken beer bottle, killed Deborah Sammons at the request of her estranged husband. The husband, who assisted in disposing of his wife's body in the trunk of a car that was then driven into a slough, was sentenced to just 25 years. Elvin Banks, 25 years on death row. Banks fatally shot a man in a wheelchair and then essayed and shot a 17-year-old girl at the man's house. He later shot to death a man at an ATM machine. He was acquitted of a 3rd murder. Michael Bell, 25 years on death row. Bell killed the clerk of a convenience store during a robbery. Irvin Blacksher, 25 years on death row. Blacksher killed his sister and her adult son, who had moved in to take care of his ailing, elderly mother with whom he lived. He was schizophrenic and often delusional and had stopped taking his medication. A jury rejected Blacksher's insanity defense. Richard Booker, 25 years on death row. Booker, at 18, killed 3 girls, ages 12 to 19, after a party at their apartment. Roger Brady, 25 years on death row. Brady, on federal parole, killed a Manhattan Beach police officer who pulled him over for a minor traffic violation. Edward Charles, 25 years on death row. Charles stabbed and beat to death his 18-year-old brother with a crescent wrench and returned home hours later to kill his parents, stuffing their bodies into a car which he then set on fire. No motive was given. Donald DeBose, 25 years on death row. DeBose and 2 other men followed the woman out of a casino, robbed and shot her, put her in the trunk of her car, and set it on fire. Enrique Dueñas, 25 years on death row. Dueñas killed the Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy who attempted to stop him on his bicycle for questioning about local robberies. Sonia Enraca, 25 years on death row. During a street fight between 2 gangs, Enraca killed 2 people and injured a third. Susan Eubanks, 25 years on death row. Eubanks shot and killed her 4 children, ages 4 to 14, then shot herself in the abdomen, but survived. Willie Harris, 25 years on death row. Harris broke into a woman's apartment, essayed and killed her, then stole her car and set it on fire. Michael Hughes, 25 years on death row. A serial killer, Hughes was sentenced to life for killing 4 women, then condemned to death after DNA evidence tied him to 3 more killings. He was charged with, but not convicted, of the killing of an 8th victim. Martin Jennings, 25 years on death row. Jennings abused and beat his 5-year-old son, ultimately killing him by hitting him on the back of the head with a fireplace shovel. William Jones, 25 years on death row. Jones killed his elderly neighbor during a robbery and essay, strangling her and then setting fire to her mobile home. Filion Lee, 25 years on death row. Lee was with friends drinking at a park when he attempted to force himself on a drunken girl. When she refused him, he shot her. Daniel Linton, 25 years on death row. Linton strangled and killed a 12-year-old girl who lived next door, seeking to essay her after she stayed home alone from school one day because she was ill. Eloy Loy, 25 years on death row. Loy raped and strangled his 12-year-old niece in her bedroom and dumped her body in a vacant lot. He had served prison time for 2 previous sexual assault convictions. Crandall McKinnon, 25 years on death row. McKinnon, a Crisp gang member, walked up to a man and shot him in the head. 5 weeks later, he killed another man after a brief argument. Kenneth McKenzie, 25 years on death row. McKenzie beat a 73-year-old woman to death during the robbery of her apartment. Ronald Moore, 25 years on death row. Moore entered the house of his neighbor while she was at work, killed her 11-year-old daughter, and then robbed the house. Joseph Mora, 25 years on death row. Mora and another condemned man murdered 2 college students who were in their car in Compton after giving a ride home to a woman whose car had broken. Charles Eng, 25 years on death row. Eng is a serial killer convicted in the deaths of 11 women and believed to have killed as many as 25. He and killing partner Leonard Lake used a dungeon adjacent to their Calaveras County cabin to torture victims. The crimes were discovered when Lake committed suicide. Lam Nguyen, 25 years on death row. Nguyen was part of a Vietnamese street gang that shot 6 people, killing 3. He was convicted for shooting 2 of them. Gerald Parker, 25 years on death row. Parker, dubbed the Bedroom Basher for a string of sex slayings that terrorized Orange County in the 1970s, attacked 6 women and killed 5 of them. The husband of 1 victim spent 16 years in prison until DNA evidence showed Parker was the actual assailant. Pedro Rangel, 25 years on death row. An argument at a baptismal party escalated into drive-by shootings, and in retaliation for his son's injury, Rangel killed his son's friend and another man and wounded a woman. Ruben Rangel, 25 years on death row. Rangel and another condemned man, Joseph Mora, we talked about him earlier, they murdered 2 college students who were in their car. Ennis Reed, 25 years on death row. Reed is condemned for a 1996 murder in Los Angeles. Robert Rhodes, 25 years on death row. Rhodes killed an 8-year-old boy in 1996. In 1984, he essayed and killed an 18-year-old San Leandro woman. Glenn Rogers, 25 years on death row. condemned in both Florida and California. In 1995, Rogers killed a woman at a Florida motel and strangled the woman to death and left her body in a burning car in Los Angeles. He is suspected of 3 other deaths in Ohio, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and at one time he claimed to have killed 70 people. Magdaleno Salazar, 25 years on death row. Salazar shot and killed a suspected gang rival at a southwest Los Angeles eatery. He had previously been convicted of murder for a shooting at age 17. Vayen Sivongsai, 25 years on death row. He killed a man during a Fresno jewelry store robbery. Matthew Souza, 25 years on death row. In retaliation for the removal of their mother from a party, Souza, his brother Michael, and the third person drove to an apartment and opened fire, killing 3 and wounding 2 others. Howard Streeter, 25 years on death row. After his abused wife left him with their children, Streeter convinced her to meet him in a parking lot and attempted to take their son. In front of her 3 other children, he poured gasoline on her and set her on fire, killing her. Correll Thomas, 25 years on death row. Thomas killed 2 men, beating to death a neighbor, and a month later chasing down a man and fatally shooting him with a submachine gun. Nathan Verdugo, 25 years on death row. Verdugo shot to death a woman and her companion after mistaking her for someone involved in a fight at a Halloween party earlier that night. Francisco Alvarez, 24 years on death row. Alvarez shook a 5-month-old boy to death and 2 years later fatally beat a 4-year-old child. John Birch, 24 years on death row. Birch and Jeffrey Fronis were condemned for kidnapping a woman from the parking lot of a Sacramento shopping mall, then essaying and killing her. Kevin Boyce, 24 years on death row. Boyce and Andre Willis burglarized a hair salon, robbing several people inside and killing an off-duty sheriff's deputy who had taken his wife to the salon for a birthday treat. Willis, tried separately, was sentenced to 75 years to life for murder and multiple consecutive terms of 25 years to life for robbery. Gabriel Castaneda, 24 years on death row. Castaneda returned to a medical clinic where he had received treatment after a minor vehicle accident and essayed and killed a clerical worker who was alone at the time. Ron Chun, 24 years on death row. Chun, the leader of an Asian street gang, killed a man and his 73-year-old father during a home invasion and killed a Pomona man he mistook as a gang rival. Chun also killed 5 family members during a home invasion robbery in San Bernardino and killed another man during a drive-by shooting. He was charged with the murder of 2 people in Spokane Wash. Omar Dean, 24 years on death row. Dean shot and killed the police chief of Calipatria, who was responding to a call for help at Dean's mother's farm, then fatally shot his mother as well. Robert Galvan, 24 years on death row. Galvan, serving 4 life sentences for robbery and kidnapping, killed his cellmate at Corcoran State Prison, which landed him the death penalty. Ruben Gomez, 24 years on death row. Months after release from state prison, Diablo Gomez killed 6 men who owed drug sales taxes to the Mexican mafia. Christopher Enriquez, 24 years on death row. Enriquez killed his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, and their 3-year-old daughter. He had previously killed a man in New York as well. Jeffrey Fronis, 24 years on death row. Fronis and John Birch were condemned for kidnapping a woman from the parking lot of a Sacramento shopping mall, then essaying and killing her. They were brought to trial 14 years after the murder. Jonathan Jackson, 24 years on death row. Jackson, a felon released from prison after serving time for robbery, shot a drug dealer and his wife during an attempted home robbery. The husband survived, but the wife died. Gerald Johnson, 24 years on death row. On the run from police for a parole violation, Johnson broke into the home of a 76-year-old woman, beat and killed her, and stole her car and jewelry. He was again pursued by police, crashed the car, and was apprehended. Keith Lewis, 24 years on death row. After an argument with his girlfriend of 7 years, Lewis shot the woman's young daughter, then used the wounded child as hostage while trying to evade police. The child died at a hospital. David Livingston, 24 years on death row. Livingston, a member of the Park Village Crisp in Compton, shot a rival Bloods gang member. In 1999, Livingston shot 4 security guards, killing 2. Hung May, 24 years on death row. May shot a California Highway Patrol officer to death after a routine traffic stop, then drove away in the patrol car. He was convicted of attempting to hire someone to murder a witness against him. Bruce Millsap, 24 years on death row. Crips gang member Bruce Millsap killed 8 people in a savage string of armored car holdups and other crimes in the mid-1990s. In 2016, a Los Angeles school assistant was arrested and accused of attempting to smuggle drugs and cell phones to Millsap in prison. Giles Nady, 24 years on death row. Nady, hired to clean carpets, essayed and killed the pastor's wife. Bernard Nelson, 24 years on death row. Nelson robbed and attempted to steal the car of a man he killed. Daniel Nunez, 24 years on death row. Nunez and William Sattel fatally shot a man and his girlfriend on the street outside the man's townhouse because they were black. Samrat Pan, 24 years on death row. Pan, a member of the Tiny Rascals, an Asian street gang, was convicted of 3 killings in Los Angeles County and Sacramento, including the slayings of a rabbit hunter they mistook for a rival gang member. Juan Sanchez, 24 years on death row. Sanchez was essaying a 16-year-old girl when he was caught by the girl's mother. He killed both of them. The woman's 5-year-old son witnessed the shooting and ran and was able to identify Sanchez. William Sattel, 24 years on death row. He was also convicted, along with Daniel Nunez, for shooting a couple just because they were black. Ropati Sumanu, 24 years on death row. Sumanu, a member of the Sons of Samoa street gang, shot a man the night before his wedding to rob him. Alex Thomas, 24 years on death row. Thomas, a convicted felon and Los Angeles gang member, essayed and killed a popular high school senior. The crime prompted laws toughening school employee background checks. Corey Williams, 24 years on death row. Williams killed a 74-year-old woman and her 53-year-old disabled daughter during a robbery of their home. Lester Wilson, 24 years on death row. When Wilson and his wife suspected a live-in friend had stolen his television, the couple held the man's family hostage at gunpoint. Wilson repeatedly essayed one of the women and tortured the friend for hours, shooting him in the knees, inviting friends to take turns beating him, and eventually shooting him to death. He was resentenced to death in 2010 after the state Supreme Court reversed the first sentence because the juror was improperly discharged. Marco Barrera, 23 years on death row. Barrera fatally beat his children, ages 2 and 5, and buried them in a shallow grave in the Angeles National Forest. Donald Brooks, 23 years on death row. Brooks tried to strangle his former girlfriend after she left him to return to her husband. He then put her body in the back of her car and set it on fire, killing her. Colvin Chisholm, 23 years on death row. Chisholm killed a man during the robbery of a liquor store using a gun stolen during a robbery of a previous store. Todd Garton, 23 years on death row. Claiming he was a CIA assassin and an IRA operative, Garton hired a friend to kill his wife, who was pregnant with their nearly full-term fetus. Kim Kopatz, 23 years on death row. Kopatz killed his wife and young daughter, seeking to collect on their life insurance policies. Rex Krebs, 23 years on death row. Krebs abducted, essayed, and killed 2 women, burying their bodies near his rented home. Michael Lopez, 23 years on death row. Lopez beat to death a toddler. Joseph Manibusan, 23 years on death row. During 2 street robberies, he fired from a car at 3 women, killing 2 and severely wounding the 3rd. Justin Merriman, 23 years on death row. Merriman, a white supremacist gang member, essayed a woman he had long known, then slit her throat. John Miles, 23 years on death row. Miles shot a man in a gang-related drive-by shooting. Richard Peñunuri, 23 years on death row. Peñunuri, a gang member, killed 2 teenagers and ordered the slaying of a man he thought would report him to police. Juan Ramirez, 23 years on death row. Ramirez kidnapped and killed a 17-year-old high school student. Wesley Shermanton, 23 years on death row. Shermanton was convicted of killing 2 men and 2 women. He and accomplice Lauren Herzog were suspected in the deaths of as many as 22 victims, but Herzog killed himself when Shermanton led a bounty hunter to body disposal sites. Richard Simon, 23 years on death row. Simon essayed a woman and killed her and her boyfriend. 2 months later, he killed a man he believed belonged to a rival Moreno Valley gang. Eduardo Vargas, 23 years on death row. Vargas, along with other gang members, forced the youth aside the Santa Ana Zoo to lie down on the ground and then shot him. Lee Capers, 22 years on death row. Capers killed a husband and wife while robbing their convenience store, essaying the woman and setting the bodies on fire. Socorro Caro, 22 years on death row. The wife of a wealthy, allegedly unfaithful doctor, Caro shot 3 of her 4 young sons to death and then shot herself in the head but survived. William Choice, 22 years on death row. Choice, a city garbage collector who abused his child, essayed and murdered 3 female prostitutes. James Daveggio, 22 years on death row. Daveggio and his girlfriend, Michelle Michaud, lured a student into a van rigged with hooks where they essayed and tortured her before dumping her body. They had similarly essayed 6 other women. Both were condemned. Dewey Duff, 22 years on death row. Duff killed 2 people outside a bar after a deal to trade guns for drugs went wrong. John Gabriel, 22 years on death row. Gabriel essayed and killed a 12-year-old La Habra boy before encasing his dismembered body in concrete chunks. Michelle Michaud, 22 years on death row. Along with her boyfriend James Daveggio, they lured the student into a van, they tortured the girl, and then they dumped the body. They were accused of doing the same thing to 6 other women. Christopher Poor, 22 years on death row. Poor, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, killed a man in Palm Springs in order to join the white supremacist gang. Carrie Stainer, 22 years on death row. Stainer, a handyman at a motel, killed 3 tourists at Yosemite National Park and beheaded a nature guide at the park. Arturo Suarez, 22 years on death row. After his wife and 2 children moved to Mexico, Suarez killed her 2 brothers and 2 of their children and raped the wife of one of the men at an Auburn ranch. Chester Turner, 22 years on death row. Turner killed 10 women, including one who was pregnant, in South Los Angeles and on LA's Skid Row between 1987 and 1998. He strangled 8 with his bare hands. He was convicted of 4 more murders in 2014. William Wright, 22 years on death row. Wright killed a man in Pomona in 2000. Thomas Battle, 21 years on death row. Battle was convicted of a 2000 murder in San Bernardino County. Alfred Flores, 21 years on death row. Flores, an El Monte gang leader, murdered 3 San Bernardino County teenagers when they refused to join his gang. Warren Hardy, 21 years on death row. Hardy and 2 others, also condemned, robbed, essayed, and then beat a 43-year-old woman to death with a fence post. She had been walking to a store in Long Beach with $6 in food stamps. Ryan Hoyt, 21 years on death row. Hoyt and 4 friends kidnapped the 15-year-old younger brother of a drug dealer, took the boy to a party, and then to the woods where they shot him to death and buried him in a shallow grave. Angelo Melendez, 21 years on death row. During the robbery of a drug dealer's house, Melendez shot and injured the dealer and killed his wife. Victor Miranda Guerrero, 21 years on death row. Miranda Guerrero essayed and killed a woman on a Huntington Beach street. He was accused of attacking 6 others. In one case, he forced his way into a car carrying 4 women and sought to kidnap them. Kenneth Nolan, 21 years on death row. Nolan and fellow inmate Travis Frazier killed another prisoner at a Tehachapi prison after the prisoner reported another inmate's misconduct to guards. Calvin Parker, 21 years on death row. Parker essayed and killed his roommate, slicing her throat and dismembering her body. Kevin Pearson, 21 years on death row. Pearson and 2 others robbed, essayed, and then beat a 43-year-old woman, Penny Sigler, to death with a fence post. The state Supreme Court overturned the sentence in 2012 because a juror was wrongfully excused from the case. Pearson was resentenced to death in 2013. Vincent Sanchez, 21 years on death row. A Simi Valley serial rapist, Sanchez kidnapped and killed a 20-year-old community college student. He had assaulted more than a dozen women. Ramon Sandoval, 21 years on death row. During a gang-related assault on a rival's house, Sandoval killed a Long Beach police officer and wounded another who happened to drive by. Michael Schultz, 21 years on death row. 6 years after the body of a woman was found essayed and strangled in her burning condominium, DNA evidence tied the murder to Schultz, a handyman. He claimed the killing was in revenge for a 1942 execution of 6 Nazi spies. What was he thinking? Dunk Trin, 21 years on death row. After his elderly and ailing mother died of a heart attack following months of home care, Trin went to the hospital where she was treated months earlier and began shooting employees, killing 3. David Westerfield, 21 years on death row. Westerfield abducted a 7-year-old girl from her house next door. Her body was found 3 weeks later in a wooded area near San Diego. Robert Lee Williams, 21 years on death row. Williams killed a father and son during a home invasion robbery. Javance Wilson, 21 years on death row. Wilson killed 2 cab drivers during separate robberies. Graylin Winbush, 21 years on death row. Winbush and an accomplice were convicted of killing a 20-year-old woman during the robbery of her Oakland apartment. He was wearing an electronic tracking device and on parole, released 10 days earlier by the California Youth Authority after serving 4 years for stealing a car at age 14. So he was just 18 years old when he committed this crime. Steve Woodruff, 21 years on death row. Riverside officers responding to a complaint call about a woman playing a loud radio were accosted by the woman's family. One of her sons, Woodruff, shot one of the officers to death. Anthony Dent, 20 years on death row. Dent killed a drug dealer who failed to pay taxes to him on drug sales. He previously killed another drug dealer and the man who walked in on the robbery of a video store. Ricky Fowler, 20 years on death row. Fowler set the old fire that burned 93,000 acres in the San Bernardino Mountains, destroying 1,000 structures and causing the heart attack deaths of 5 men. Todd Givens, 20 years on death row. Givens, a white supremacist, and his wife stabbed and shot to death 2 brothers at the behest of a prison gang. Larry Hazlett, 20 years on death row. A serial rapist, Hazlett killed a former neighbor, a beauty pageant queen. He was convicted based on DNA found on a blanket at the murder scene. Julian Mendez, 20 years on death row. Mendez, a gang member, shot a 15-year-old boy and the boy's 14-year-old sister. Angelina Rodriguez, 20 years on death row. Rodriguez took out a $250,000 life insurance policy on her husband, then began trying to kill him. She tried feeding him poisonous oleander leaves and leaving an open gas line in the house, and then she tainted his Gatorade with antifreeze, which eventually killed him. Maurice Steskal, 20 years on death row. Steskal killed an Orange County Sheriff's deputy, firing an AK-47 as the officer pulled into a convenience store. Osvaldo Amezcua, 19 years on death row. Amezcua and another gang member, Joseph Flores, were condemned for killing 4 people shortly after being released from prison. The victims included 2 teen boys mistaken for gang member. Eric Anderson, 19 years on death row. While on parole, he murdered a local businessman during a botched home robbery. Months earlier, he killed a woman in a car crash. Cragen Armstrong, 19 years on death row. He killed a man he mistook as a gang rival, then killed the man's 2 brothers as they tried to investigate the murder. The state Supreme Court overturned the conviction because a juror had improperly been removed from deliberations, allowing for a retrial. Alejandro Avila, 19 years on death row. Avila kidnapped, essayed, and murdered Samantha Runyon, a 5-year-old Stanton girl who disappeared in 2002 during a rash of high-profile child abductions. Manuel Bracamontes, 19 years on death row. Bracamontes, in 1991, kidnapped, essayed, and stabbed to death a 9-year-old girl who lived near him. He was captured 14 years later on DNA evidence. Douglas Dworak, 19 years on death row. Dworak essayed and drowned an 80-year-old woman at Musel Shoals Beach. He was identified 2 years later on a national DNA database match. Joseph Flores, 19 years on death row. Flores and fellow gang member Osvaldo Amezcua were condemned for killing 4 people, including 2 teen boys mistaken for gang members shortly after being released from prison. Pravin Govin, 19 years on death row. Brothers Virenda and Pravin Govin, who owned a Studio City motel, strangled and burned a business rival, her 2 children, and her mother-in-law during a bitter dispute over an alley that separated their properties. Glenn Helzer, 19 years on death row. Brothers Glenn and Justin Helzer killed 5 people, cutting up their bodies and dumping them in the Sacramento River Delta in a bizarre plot to raise money to overthrow the Mormon Church. Both were condemned. Justin Helzer committed suicide on death row. Mervyn Hughes, 19 years on death row. Hughes killed 2 people during a series of shootings in East Oakland in which 7 other people were wounded. Bailey Jackson, 19 years on death row. Jackson kidnapped and murdered an 82-year-old woman whose body was never found, and 6 weeks later he essayed an 84-year-old woman living in the same Riverside neighborhood. Tuputo Mataele, 19 years on death row. I really don't know how to pronounce this name. After a falling out with a former crime partner, he and an accomplice lured the man out of his apartment and shot him in the head. Andrew Michael, 19 years on death row. He shot a police officer to death in Red Bluff and planted a "Don't Tread on Me" flag next to the body. He took responsibility for the death with an internet post claiming he sought to halt police state tactics. Alfonso Morales, 19 years on death row. Morales killed 4 members of a South Whittier family after one of the family's daughters spurned his advances. The throats of the husband and grandmother were slit, the wife was stabbed to death, and an 8-year-old daughter was essayed and drowned in a bathtub. Johnny Morales, 19 years on death row. Morales shot a woman to death during a home invasion robbery. Troy Powell, 19 years on death row. Powell bludgeoned to death a woman in her apartment. Marcus Wesson, 19 years on death row. Wesson, a family cult leader, ordered the deaths of 9 of his children, all born of incest with his daughters. The mass murder was triggered by efforts of a niece to retrieve her children. George Williams, 19 years on death row. Based on DNA evidence collected 17 years after the crime, Williams, a previously convicted child rapist, was identified as the person who kidnapped, essayed, and strangled to death 14-year-old Rickian Blake of Chula Vista. A caller claiming to be the killer harassed her family for 10 years with taunting calls. Adrian Camacho, 18 years on death row. Camacho killed an Oceanside police officer in a shootout after the officer attempted to stop his car where Camacho had concealed heroin. Johnny Espinoza, 18 years on death row. Espinoza and fellow gang members killed 2 children who were in a car with members of a rival gang and later killed an 18-year-old boy. Robert Frazier, 18 years on death row. Frazier, a drifter from Indiana, attacked a woman on a walking trail, essayed her, and killed her. Mao Hin, 18 years on death row. Hin, the member of a Stockton Street gang, killed a man during a series of robberies, accosting him and his girlfriend in a park where they were taking a walk. Billy Johnson, 18 years on death row. Obeying orders from a white supremacist street gang, Billy Joe Johnson killed former Public Enemy No. 1 leader Scott Miller after Miller appeared on a local television show, his features disguised but his dog and tattoos identifiable. John was previously involved in the prison murder of a child sex offender. Jose Leon, 18 years on death row. Upset that his girlfriend left to study abroad, Leon attacked her family, stabbing her grandmother and younger brother to death and attempting to kill her grandfather with a hatchet. Huber Mendoza, 18 years on death row. Wearing a bulletproof vest, Mendoza stormed the house where his estranged wife had moved and shot the occupants, killing his mother-in-law, his wife's cousin, and the man his wife was dating. Louis Mitchell, 18 years on death row. Mitchell killed a sales manager and a salesman at a Colton used car lot after his girlfriend bought a car there. He then went to an apartment complex where he killed a teenage boy and shot the boy's brother. Janine Snyder, 18 years on death row. Snyder and Michael Thornton preyed on teen girls they abducted. They drugged, essayed, tortured, and killed a 16-year-old girl they kidnapped in Las Vegas. Snyder also admitted to killing a 15-year-old girl who had been missing for 5 years. Michael Thornton was also given a death sentence and has been on death row for 18 years. Pedro Valles, 18 years on death row. Valles shot and killed a gang rival he encountered at a gas station. Timothy Young, 18 years on death row. Brothers Donald and Timothy Young killed 5 people and wounded the 6th during a robbery at a Tulare bar following a pool tournament. Carlos Argueta, 17 years on death row. Argueta shot and killed a man riding in a car on Valentine's Day. The next day, with an accomplice, Argueta sprayed bullets from a submachine gun at a group standing outside a nightclub, killing a 12-year-old boy and injuring 2 others. Julian Beltran, 17 years on death row. Beltran slit the throats of his former girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, ages 6 and 2, after she would not reconcile with him. Vincent Brothers, 17 years on death row. Brothers, a former Bakersfield school principal, killed his wife, 3 children, and mother-in-law so that he could start a new life without supporting them. Refugio Cardenas, 17 years on death row. Cardenas shot 2 men he believed to be rival gang members. Alex DeMole, 17 years on death row. DeMole essayed and killed an 11-year-old girl he convinced to enter his apartment with the promise she could play video games. Wayne Ford, 17 years on death row. Ford, a former long-haul truck driver, murdered 3 prostitutes and a hitchhiker, strangling them during sex and cutting off body parts. He turned himself in years later with the breast of a woman in a bag in his coat pocket. Alexander Hamilton, 17 years on death row. After robbing a grocery store and a bank branch, Hamilton and a partner were pursued by police. Stopping, Hamilton fired on and killed a Pittsburgh police officer. Ivan Hill, 17 years on death row. Hill, dubbed the 60 Freeway Killer, essayed and strangled 6 prostitutes in Orange County in 1993 and in 1994. His link to the crimes was discovered 10 years later through DNA evidence while he was in the state prison for armed robbery. He pleaded guilty 2 years later to killing 2 other women in 1986 and 1987, and he was also convicted for the 1979 murder of a Glendora liquor store clerk during a robbery. Jonathan Luther, 17 years on death row. Luther, a daily meth user, shot a 74-year-old retired professor to death, firing through a window at the victim's home. He told police he had been drawn to kill the man because the man was bad. Jose Orozco, 17 years on death row. Orozco shot and killed a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy who was building a case against him in another shooting. Santiago Pineda, 17 years on death row. Pineda wandered for hours through a Los Angeles jail to find a witness who had testified against him in a murder case and strangled that witness in his cell. Irving Ramirez, 17 years on death row. Fearing that he would return to prison for a parole violation, Ramirez killed a San Leandro police officer responding to a neighborhood disturbance call. Cuitlatuac Rivera, 17 years on death row. Rivera, a gang member, killed a Merced police officer during a traffic stop. Donald Shorts, 17 years on death row. Compton gang members Shorts and Jamar Tucker, sentenced to life for previous murders, killed another inmate while awaiting trial in Los Angeles on other charges. Lorenzo Arias, 16 years on death row. In a gang power grab that became known as the Dead President's Case, Arias and 3 others killed 4 men, including 2 presidents of cliques of the West Side Verdungo gang. Juan Chavez, 16 years on death row. Chavez killed 2 people in a gang-related attack and a week later killed a woman, the subject of a PBS film documentary on foster care, who was a potential witness. Tecumseh Colbert, 16 years on death row. Colbert killed an investment banker outside his apartment and 2 weeks later shot and killed a clerk at a liquor store. Michael Cook, 16 years on death row. 2 elderly women were killed when Cook set fire to their mobile home so he could burglarize neighboring trailers. James Dixon, 16 years on death row. Dixon and 2 others abducted a woman in Pomona, forced her to empty her bank account, and then slit her throat and left her body in the mountains. Ralph Flores, 16 years on death row. An Azusa 13 gang enforcer, Flores killed 4 people over a span of 5 years. Travis Frazier, 16 years on death row. In prison for murder, Frazier and another inmate who identified themselves as skinheads stabbed to death a prisoner who had fallen into disfavor with a white prison gang. Michael Lamb, 16 years on death row. Lamb, a member of a white supremacist gang and an accomplice, killed another member who revealed gang information by appearing on a local television news show in disguise. Luis Mendoza, 16 years on death row. In a gang power grab that became known as the Dead President's Case, Mendoza and 3 others killed 4 men. Carl Molano, 16 years on death row. He essayed and strangled a neighbor. The crime remained unsolved until his ex-wife came forward in 2001 after her former husband was returned to prison for choking her. Barry Mosley, 16 years on death row. Mosley killed 2 women and a teenage girl and essayed and attempted to murder the 8-year-old daughter of one of his victims in Los Angeles in 1999 and then in 2000. Anthony Navarro, 16 years on death row. Navarro was one of 4 gang members hired to abduct and kill a businessman so his sister could take over the family enterprise. The getaway driver in the killing, Alberto Martinez, also was condemned. Jesus Penuelas, 16 years on death row. Penuelas and 2 accomplices went to the home of a co-worker to steal money she was saving to buy a car, essayed her, and put her in the trunk of a car. After driving to a rural area, Penuelas pulled the woman out of the trunk and repeatedly drove over her with his car. Theodore Shove, 16 years on death row. Shove hired a hitman to kill an elderly couple in order to take over their surplus hardware and tool business. Justin Thomas, 16 years on death row. Fearing he would be turned in to the police, Thomas in 1992 killed a man who sold him meth. In 1996, he killed a woman in Texas for which he received a life term. Ronald Tran, 16 years on death row. Tran and Noel Plata, both 25, pushed their way into the home of an 18-year-old woman, hogtied her, and tortured her until she revealed where her family had hidden their valuables. Then they killed her. Javier Victoriane, 16 years on death row. Victoriane essayed and killed a 37-year-old woman and a 16-year-old girl in Riverside County a year apart after they rebuffed his sexual advances. He left their bodies bound, one hanging in a closet and the other from a tree. He was tried and condemned 7 years later. Brent Volovich, 16 years on death row. The son of a Bay Area police officer who killed himself after robbing a bank in 1997, Volovich fatally shot a California highway patrol officer during a routine traffic stop. Jason Aguirre, 15 years on death row. At the behest of the Dragon family gang, Aguirre fired into a car he was told held rival gang members. The victims instead were family members who had gone out for fish tacos. The youngest, 13, bled to death. Paul Baker, 15 years on death row. Baker killed a 60-year-old woman who had taken him in after she met him at Alcoholics Anonymous. During trial, he was accused of essaying women he had met at recovery groups. He interrupted his own trial by screaming and smearing his face in his own feces. Ruben Becerrada, 15 years on death row. Becerrada, a Los Angeles gang member, essayed his girlfriend and then stabbed and strangled her to death after she reported the assault to authorities. Stephen Cheatham, 15 years on death row. Cheatham fatally shot 2 people, including a 14-year-old girl, and attempted to murder 2 others. Skylar De Leon, 15 years on death row. De Leon posed as a prospective buyer of a yacht owned by a Newport Beach couple. He convinced them to take him and 2 other men out to sea, where the 3 men threw the couple overboard. De Leon and John Kennedy were sentenced to death. The other man and De Leon's wife were sentenced to prison for their parts in the crime. Calvin Dennis, 15 years on death row. Dennis and Rayon Ingram were convicted of killing a father and son as part of a robbery in Compton in 2006. The man had robbed Derek Kellum Sr. of his wallet, then lured him to the scene of his death by offering to return it. Kellum was shot 9 times. His 10-year-old son was also shot. Steve Evans, 15 years on death row. A registered sex offender, Evans stabbed to death a woman whose body was found inside a trailer. Jose Guerrero, 15 years on death row. Guerrero killed 3 women from 1995 through 1998 and attacked a fourth, slashing her throat and face. Kai Harris, 15 years on death row. Harris and another man in 2004 killed a rival gang member in a drug dispute, then shot 3 women who witnessed the attack, killing 1. Rayon Ingram, 15 years on death row. Together with Calvin Dennis, they were convicted of killing a father and a son as part of a robbery in Compton in 2006. Stephen Jones, 15 years on death row. Jones was sentenced to death for fatally shooting 1 man in a car wash robbery and bludgeoning a woman to death at a Lancaster motel. He also attacked his roommates with a hatchet, robbed and stabbed a man in Arizona, essayed a cellmate in Los Angeles jail, and attempted to kill another prisoner. Darrell Kemp, 15 years on death row. Kemp was condemned to death for the 1957 essay and murder of a nurse in her Los Angeles apartment. He was spared execution because of insanity, and, after capital punishment was overturned by the state, he was paroled in 1978. 4 months later, he murdered a woman jogging on a trail near Berkeley. He was not captured and went to Texas, where he raped 6 women. He eventually was convicted on DNA evidence. John Kennedy, 15 years on death row. Together with Skylar De Leon, they convinced a couple to take them aboard their yacht, where the couple was thrown overboard. Ricky Madison, 15 years on death row. After being released from prison, where he served time for stabbing a girlfriend to death, Madison killed another girlfriend in 2006, stabbing her 172 times. He was condemned to death by a Los Angeles jury. Carlos Martinez, 15 years on death row. Martinez murdered an elderly couple, ages 83 and 73, during a home invasion robbery in Orange County. Santiago Martinez, 15 years on death row. Martinez drew a life sentence for stabbing and shooting a Long Beach woman and a death sentence for killing his girlfriend 2 weeks later because she would not help him cover up the first murder. Dante McDaniel, 15 years on death row. McDaniel is a South Los Angeles gang member convicted of fatally shooting 2 people in a Watts home and attempting to kill 2 others. Timothy McGee, 15 years on death row. He was a shot caller for a notorious gang in northeast Los Angeles. A jury found him guilty of 3 murders and the attempted murder of 2 police officers. Raymond Euler, 15 years on death row. Euler set several forest fires, including the Esperanza fire, in which 5 firefighters were killed. Gene Rices, 16 years on death row. Rices fatally shot 2 people during a liquor store robbery. Samuel Rivera, 15 years on death row. In a gang-related incident, Rivera shot into a van carrying field workers, killing 1 man and endangering 13 others. Raul Sarinana, 15 years on death row, along with Kathy Sarinana, also 15 years on death row. Raul and Kathy beat to death 2 nephews left in their care. Benjamin Wata, 15 years on death row. Wata essayed and killed a 70-year-old Seal Beach woman after she went to feed her neighbor's cats. Edward Wyckoff, 15 years on death row. Wyckoff killed his sister and her husband, claiming they sought to ostracize him from family events and steal his deceased father's house. Tony Yonko, 15 years on death row. Yonko used a hammer to bludgeon a man to death during a home burglary. Roman Aldana, 14 years on death row. Aldana was convicted of torture and murder for killing a 16-year-old runaway who was living with him after he believed she had become pregnant. He stabbed her more than 100 times. Alberto Alvarez, 14 years on death row. Alvarez shot and killed an East Palo Alto police officer during a foot chase after the officer responded to reports of a fight outside a restaurant. Jeffrey Butner, 14 years on death row. Butner and an accomplice, Glenn Jones, beat an 18-year-old girl to death and stuffed her body into an oil drum after she told police about their burglary activities. Anthony Kane, 14 years on death row. Kane stabbed to death his elderly aunt and uncle, both 75, in 2004 after cashing a $6,000 check against their bank account. Robert Castro, 14 years on death row. Castro received a death sentence for killing a man who balked at the arranged sale of a stolen laptop. He was sentenced to life for shooting to death another man who caught him in a home robbery. Aaron Dunn, 14 years on death row. High on meth and distraught over his marital breakup, Dunn used a shotgun to kill 2 men as they left an Elk Grove restaurant and shot at 4 others, including 2 police officers. Christopher Evans, 14 years on death row. Evans killed 2 people in a 2001 shooting following a fight at an Oakland hair salon. George Hernandez, 14 years on death row. On orders from Mexican mafia leaders, he killed another gang member believed to be a police informant, gaining rank in the gang. He claimed he feared for his own life if he disobeyed. Christopher Jasso, 14 years on death row. He shot and killed a taxi driver during an ambush robbery. Glenn Jennings, 14 years on death row. On parole after 23 years in prison for robbery, he stabbed the owner of a Sacramento liquor store to death, then stole the cash register. Mila Johnson, 14 years on death row. Johnson killed 2 roommates, both longtime friends of his, and blinded the third person during a 2006 dispute over the dividing of proceeds from a drug ripoff. Glenn Jones, 14 years on death row. Together with Jeffrey Butner, they killed an 18-year-old girl. That was because she threatened to go to the police and tell them about their burglary activities. Jimmy Kelly, 14 years on death row. A meth addict who years earlier had killed a child during a drunk driving accident, Kelly confessed to shooting 2 men and a woman to death during a 2004 home robbery in Yucca Valley. His female companion pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Randolph Kling, 14 years on death row. A con artist who assumed false identities, Kling killed the 2 owners of a metal fabrication business, seeking to marry the widow of one of the victims and take over the business. Talk about delusional. Travis Lewis, 14 years on death row. A Compton gang member, Lewis killed 1 man he mistook as a gang rival and shot to death another man who interrupted the robbery of a taco truck. Valerie Martin, 14 years on death row. Martin, along with her 2 teen sons and a convict, beat the man in whose mobile home she lived, put his body in the trunk of his car, and set the vehicle on fire. Alberto Martinez, 14 years on death row. He was the getaway driver for 3 other gang members who had been hired by a woman to kidnap and kill her brother so she could take over the family business. 2 other gang members also were condemned. The woman was sentenced to life in prison. Jose Mejorado, 14 years on death row. Mejorado and 3 other gang members killed 2 female acquaintances because the young women knew about an earlier killing. Tanya Nelson, 14 years on death row. After she lost her house and her business failed, Nelson returned from North Carolina to seek retaliation against her longtime fortune teller. She convinced an accomplice to kill the woman while she stabbed the woman's daughter to death. Rodrigo Paniagua, 14 years on death row. Paniagua stabbed to death his pregnant girlfriend and their 2 daughters, ages 6 and 3, then set their bodies on fire. He had a history of domestic violence. Antonio Rodriguez, 14 years on death row. He essayed and beat to death the 5-year-old daughter of his girlfriend and brutalized the woman's 6-year-old son for months. The mother was sentenced to more than 28 years for failing to protect her children and abetting their abuse. Brock Rottiers, 14 years on death row. Rottiers led 2 day laborers to a motel room where she promised to have relations with them. With 2 male accomplices, she attacked and robbed them. She then gagged the victims until they suffocated. Derlin Threats, 14 years on death row. Threats, a former Marine sergeant, tortured and stabbed a woman to death after she discovered he had broken into her home to steal her son's video games. Scott Varner, 14 years on death row. Varner and his 17-year-old accomplice carjacked a Reading woman and forced her to drive them to a remote area where he strangled her to death and robbed her. Gregory Whiteside, 14 years on death row. Whiteside killed his former girlfriend and her 18-month-old daughter. He then slit his own wrists and lay down next to the bodies, but was discovered in time. David Zanon, 14 years on death row. A felon released from prison, Zanon was fleeing police in a car packed with stolen goods when he struck and killed a California Highway Patrol officer attempting to stop his car with a spike strip. Cimarron Bell, 13 years on death row. Bell and an accomplice used a car sales ad to lure 3 people to a home to rob and murder them. He fatally shot his girlfriend in the head because he suspected she was stealing from him. Kevin Bernudi, 13 years on death row. Bernudi, a Los Angeles gang member, was convicted in 2011 of a 2006 murder. During a bitter divorce and to prevent the woman from helping federal authorities investigating his international gold trading firm, millionaire businessman Fayed arranged the contract killing of his wife, whose throat was slit. Marcus Fletcher, 13 years on death row. Fletcher and an accomplice killed a liquor store clerk during a robbery. Armando Macias, 13 years on death row. Macias, along with Alberto Martinez and Anthony Navarro, were hired by a woman to abduct and kill her brother so she could take over the family business. A fourth accomplice in the killing, a juvenile at the time, was sentenced as an adult to life without parole. Jason Richardson, 13 years on death row. Richardson killed the night manager of a Home Depot during a robbery. Ricardo Villa, 13 years on death row. Decade-old DNA evidence tied Villa to the essay and murder of an 87-year-old deaf and mute woman who was stabbed to death in her apartment at a senior citizens complex. Michael Barbar, 12 years on death row. Barbar strangled his wife to death and fatally beat his 6-year-old daughter after learning he was not the girl's biological father. Letice Brown, 12 years on death row. Brown was a serial rapist who killed a 16-year-old girl, essaying and suffocating her and then setting her body on fire. His victims included 5 other women. Sherhan Brown, 12 years on death row. After breaking into their home, Brown essayed a woman and slashed her throat and stabbed her mother-in-law to death. Pedro Espinoza, 12 years on death row. The day after being released from jail in a gun-related incident, Espinoza, an undocumented immigrant, killed a high school athlete after mistaking his red backpack as a sign he belonged to a rival street gang. Eusebio Fierros, 12 years on death row. With the aid of a 17-year-old girl, Fierros abducted and beat an 85-year-old neighbor and trapped the man in the trunk of his car. His partner, Juan Ramon Coronado, then shot the victim in the face. The man was also condemned. Joanne Graham, 12 years on death row. Graham pulled up to a car on Highway 91 and began firing his rifle, killing 2 men. Earl Green, 12 years on death row. While on parole, Green shot and killed a Riverside police officer after a traffic stop and foot chase. David Mills, 12 years on death row. Mills, providing security to a house where drugs were being sold, killed 3 people in 2005 in a dispute over a gun. He pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter for killing a 4th person in 1997. Ryan Moore, 12 years on death row. Moore and associate Charles Ray Smith, using AK-47s, killed 3 people, including a 10-year-old boy, on a South LA street in a shooting that became known as the 49th Street Massacre. The victims were mistaken for gang rivals. Gabriel Ronquillo, 12 years on death row. In gang-related killings 5 years apart, Ronquillo killed 2 people, one a rival gang member, and one the brother of a man whose death had been ordered by the Mexican mafia. Marco Topete, 12 years on death row. On parole, Topete led officers on a chase when they responded to a report of a man drinking while driving. Then he fired an assault rifle from the side of a house, killing a Yolo County Sheriff's deputy. Manling Williams, 12 years on death row. Williams stabbed her husband to death with a sword and smothered their 2 sons, ages 7 and 3, with a pillow in their bunk beds. Jeffrey Aguilar, 11 years on death row. Aguilar killed a businessman leaving a bank and robbed him of $100,000. Ronald Brim, 11 years on death row. Brim fatally shot 2 men and hurt 3 bystanders at a Compton metro station following a gang-related dispute. Nathan Burris, 11 years on death row. Burris killed his former girlfriend, a Caltrans toll booth worker, and a transit bus driver after he suspected the two had developed a romantic relationship. Osman Canales, 11 years on death row. Canales kidnapped a woman, drove her to the bank to empty her account, and then returned with her to her business, where he killed her and her business partner by slitting their throats. Daniel Cervantes, 11 years on death row. Carlos Contreras, 11 years on death row. Cervantes and Carlos Contreras kidnapped an Indio man, robbed him, bound his hands with electrical cable, and then shot him in the head, dumping the body and using his credit card to buy gas. Contreras had previously robbed and shot a man and kidnapped a woman in 2 other carjacking cases. Richard Hirschfield, 11 years on death row. Hirschfield killed 2 Davis College students and dumped their bodies. He was convicted 33 years later based on new DNA evidence. Emrys John, 11 years on death row. John and 2 other men were condemned for killing a former Marine and his wife. With a 4th accomplice, they forced the man to watch as each essayed his wife. Wayman Livingston, 11 years on death row. Livingston essayed and murdered the Sacramento woman and essayed 4 other women. Jesse Manzo, 11 years on death row. Manzo shot a black man, targeting him because of his race and remarks against the Hispanic gang to which Manzo belonged. Desi Marentes, 11 years on death row. Marentes, a member of a street gang, shot 10 times at a man standing at a bus stop, targeting him because he was black. Tyrone Miller, 11 years on death row. Miller and 2 other men were condemned for killing a former Marine and his wife. With a 4th accomplice, they forced the man to watch as each essayed his wife. Joseph Nazo, 11 years on death row. Nazo was convicted of killing 6 women over the course of 2 decades after a probation officer discovered a diary describing the deaths of 10 women. 4 of the women described in that diary remain unidentified. Christian Perez, 11 years on death row. Los Angeles jail inmates Perez and Heriberto Rodriguez beat and stomped another inmate to death as more than 35 other inmates watched. John Perez, 11 years on death row. Rudy Ruiz, 11 years on death row. Perez and Rudy Ruiz opened fire into a crowded pizza parlor in 2009, killing 3 and wounding 7 others. Charles Smith, 11 years on death row. Smith and associate Ryan T. Moore, using AK-47s, killed 3 people, including a 10-year-old boy, on a South LA street in a shooting that became known as the 49th Street Massacre. The victims were mistaken for gang rivals. Anthony Wade, 11 years on death row. Wade essayed, tortured, and fatally stabbed an 84-year-old widow after breaking into her Anaheim home. Francisco Beltran, 10 years on death row. During a robbery with gang members, Beltran shot a man in the head who spoke disrespectfully to him. Leonardo Cisneros, 10 years on death row. During a gang-related series of robberies, Cisneros fatally shot a Subway sandwich shop worker and the man he encountered in a parking lot. Jessica Hahn, 10 years on death row. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder but refusing medication, Hahn killed his 2 infants, each within weeks of being born, after becoming enraged by their crying. The crimes were committed in Vermont and California. Angel Mendoza, 10 years on death row. A self-proclaimed homeless gang member addicted to drugs, Mendoza killed 2 car salesmen and 2 other men during a string of robberies over a 7-month period in East Los Angeles. Among his victims was a taxi driver who refused to sell him drugs on credit. Joseph Nisonson, 10 years on death row. He killed 3 runaway teen girls in Monterrey and El Dorado counties, but did not become a suspect until his ex-wife told authorities he had also killed a woman in Washington. Cason Sykes, 10 years on death row. Sykes and 2 other men were condemned for killing a former Marine and his wife. With a 4th accomplice, they forced the man to watch as each essayed his wife. Ronnie Vang, 10 years on death row. Out of prison 4 days for a prior burglary, Vang and a cousin broke into a home and awakened a resident, whom he tied up and then shot in the back. Aaron West, 10 years on death row. West, an East Side Crips member, shot a woman and her boyfriend over Labor Day weekend in 2010 over an alleged debt. Robert Caballero, 9 years on death row. Caballero shot a rival gang member to death, strangled a woman and had her buried on a mountainside, and watched as an accomplice strangled and stoned his cousin to death. Juan Coronado, 9 years on death row. Coronado shot an 85-year-old man in the face after his 2 accomplices had beaten the victim and trapped him in the trunk of his car. One accomplice, Eusebio Fierros, was also condemned to death. Robert Dunson, 9 years on death row. Dunson beat a Canadian visitor to death for his casino winnings after having his sister pose as a prostitute to lure the victim to an apartment. His sister and 3 other accomplices were sentenced to life without parole. Angel Esparza, 9 years on death row. While on parole, Esparza killed a 16-year-old girl and, in a separate incident, 2 farm workers. Miguel Felix, 9 years on death row. Felix killed a man during a series of home invasion robberies. Robert Fuller, 9 years on death row. After receiving a restraining order for threatening his wife and 2 daughters, Fuller shot his wife and her 69-year-old mother to death. Tyrone Hartz, 9 years on death row. Hartz returned to the home where he had lived with his girlfriend and her 6 children, shot her, and set her on fire. 4 of the children attempted to douse the flames with cups of water from the bathroom. Corey King, 9 years on death row. King was 18 when he stabbed the 43-year-old woman, then turned on her daughters, fatally stabbing the 14-year-old, stomping the 11-year-old to death, and strangling the 9-year-old. Belinda Magana, 9 years on death row. Magana and her boyfriend beat her 2-year-old son and scalded him. He died of trauma to the head and sepsis from his untreated wounds. Iftekhar Murtaza, 9 years on death row. He killed the father and sister of his ex-girlfriend and left their charred bodies in an urban park. Naresh Narin, 9 years on death row. He was the boyfriend of Belinda Magana. They beat and scalded her 2-year-old son. Eddie Neely, 9 years on death row. DNA evidence linked Neely to the essay and murder of a 14-year-old girl 2 decades earlier. He was a suspect in another murder and convicted of 2 other essays. Francisco Zavala, 9 years on death row. Zavala and 2 others, both juveniles, chased, beat, and stabbed to death a 16-year-old boy after school to steal his cell phone. Michael Brown, 8 years on death row. Brown was convicted 16 years after stabbing a Kern County woman to death. The case was based on DNA evidence collected after his essay of 4 other women. Romaine Martin, 8 years on death row. Martin was a gang shot caller who ordered the killing of a Moreno Valley man following a home invasion robbery of the man's condominium. The actual shooter was sentenced to life without parole. Joseph Mercado, 8 years on death row. Mercado killed his former girlfriend, her father, and brother during a shooting rampage at their Hawaiian Gardens home. Ka Pasasuk, 8 years on death row. He killed 4 people at a Northridge boarding home. He shot one of the victims because of a dispute and killed the other 3 because they were witnesses. Michael Thomas, 8 years on death row. From county jail, Thomas arranged for the Halloween night killing of a Beverly Grove man whose home he had robbed a year earlier and intended to testify against him. The gunman was sentenced to life without parole. Darnell Williams, 8 years on death row. Williams fatally shot an 8-year-old girl at a sleepover and injured 3 others, and 2 months later shot to death a 22-year-old man. He said he was seeking revenge for the killing of a friend. Daniel Wozniak, 8 years on death row. Wozniak, a former community theater actor, killed two friends to steal money for his upcoming wedding, ambushing one at a military training ground and luring the other friend to the deceased man's apartment to shoot her there. Raymond Barrera, 7 years on death row. Barrera, an admitted member of a San Jacinto Valley street gang, fatally shot 3 men and tried to kill another. Christopher Cherry, 7 years on death row. He essayed and bludgeoned to death the 3-year-old daughter of the girlfriend with whom he was living. David Contreras, 7 years on death row. Contreras attacked and killed 3 people at random, first a man who was walking his dog, then a woman and her adult daughter. He jumped them and stabbed them to death while taking a stroll. His lawyers said he is suffering from severe schizophrenia. James Ellis, 7 years on death row. In an attempt with 4 other gang members to rob a drug dealer, Ellis fired into the dealer's car, killing him and the female passenger. Stephen Gordon, 7 years on death row. While under state parole supervision as a offender, Gordon and accomplice Frank Cano kidnapped and killed 4 female prostitutes. Gordon acted as his own lawyer during the trial, confessing to the killings. A 5th victim remained unidentified, and the body was never found. Elias Lopez, 7 years on death row. In gang ambush shootings, Lopez lured one rival to an alley and shot him, and shot another as the man sat in his car. Jurors in his first trial deadlocked, and Lopez maintained his innocence in his second trial. 4 years after the killings, he was charged while in prison in Arizona. Heraclio Meza, 7 years on death row. Meza shot one man in a street fight. In a case of mistaken identity, he shot another man to death as he drove by in a car. Cherry Rhodes, 7 years on death row. Rhodes, the former chairwoman of the Cedarville Rancheria tribe of northern Paiute, first shot and then stabbed victims during a tribal meeting to decide if she would be evicted from tribal housing. Gilbert Sanchez, 7 years on death row. A DNA match years later tied Sanchez to the essay and strangulation murder of a bakery worker during a night robbery. Darnell Washington, 7 years on death row. After escaping from jail on robbery charges, Washington broke into the home of a kindergarten teacher, stabbed her to death, and stole her car. Johnny Lopez, 7 years on death row. On November 9, 2013, Lopez killed his wife, 36-year-old Joanna Angel Barrientos Lopez, and his 5-year-old daughter Mia. 2 shots to the head were fired to each victim. Subsequently, they were found in the living room of Lopez's single-story home. He drove to the house of his ex-girlfriend following the shootings. With a stolen axe and knife from a nearby property, he took control of the 30-year-old victim and essayed her. Lopez cut the woman's throat partially with a knife. He said he did this to get rid of his baggage. Lorraine Hunter, 7 years on death row. She murdered her husband to collect a life insurance policy. She also convinced her daughter to help kill her stepfather, and the daughter was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Luis Rodriguez, 16 years on death row. Rodriguez was found guilty of killing 2 guys from a rival Latino gang as a member of another Latino gang. He had already been given a life sentence for another murder for which he was implicated. In 2018, he also murdered a fellow death row inmate. Michael Flinner, 20 years on death row. Flinner is incarcerated on death row for killing Tamra Keck in 2000. He contacted Tamra Keck, his fiancée, on June 11, 2000, when she was shopping. In order for her to assist in jump-starting Heron Ontiveros, also known as Juan de la Torre, his former employee, he instructed her to meet him at a nearby gas station. After picking Ontiveros up from the gas station, Keck drove to his car, which was parked in a nearby cul-de-sac. Keck was fatally shot in the back of the head by Ontiveros, who approached her from behind while she was holding the hood of her car open. Flinner's business was not profitable, and he arranged the murder of his girlfriend to collect a life insurance policy. Miguel Crespo, 31 years on death row. In October 2013, Crespo had only 8 hours in a cell at Kern Valley State Prison with Carmen Guerrero, a transgender woman. However, in those 8 hours, he tortured, tied, and killed her. As a result of his 1993 Los Angeles County murder conviction, Crespo was already serving a life term. One person was killed and another was seriously injured when he fired a gun into a car. Harold Ray Memrow, or Reno NFN, 37 years on death row. Reno was formerly known as Harold Ray Memrow prior to changing his name in 1994. He was given the death penalty after being found guilty of killing 3 little boys. Ronald McPeters, 38 years on death row. He was convicted of first-degree murder committed during a robbery. Isauro Aguirre, 6 years on death row. 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez of Palmdale, California, passed away on May 24, 2013, after being beaten 2 days earlier by his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. Gabriel had endured months of abuse and torment. Isauro Aguirre and Pearl Fernandez were found guilty of first-degree murder under extraordinary circumstances involving torture. Prosecutors claimed that since Aguirre thought Gabriel was gay, he mistreated him. Pearl received a life sentence without a possibility of release, and Aguirre received the death penalty. Luis Bracamontes, 6 years on death row. On October 24, 2014, Bracamontes opened fire on 3 sheriff's deputies in the Sacramento metropolitan area, wounding one and killing the others. A civilian was also hurt during the incident. Mexican national Bracamontes was convicted of substances trafficking and he was an illegal immigrant. Eric Jimenez, 6 years on death row. For a number of killings as well as other offenses, Eric Jimenez received a death sentence. He is a gang member who was previously convicted of 2 counts of murder. According to the prosecution, one of the murders happened in a jail. David Ponce, 6 years on death row. Max Rafael, 31, and David Ponce, 36, were found guilty on 1 count of kidnapping and 5 counts of murder. At a camp of tents next to the 405 freeway in 2008, Vanessa Malepule, Frederick Neumeyer, Hamid Shaifat, Catherine Verdun, and Lorenzo Villicana were discovered shot and killed. Rafael and Ponce, who had been captured on tape ostensibly boasting about the murders to a jailhouse informant, were indicted by authorities 4 years later. In addition, Ponce was found guilty of abducting and killing Tony Bledsoe, whose body was discovered in Lake Los Angeles in 2009. John Felix, 5 years on death row. On October 8, 2016, Felix started shooting after police were called to his residence for a domestic argument. He shot 21 times at the cops, leaving 2 dead and numerous others injured. After Felix barricaded himself in the house, SWAT team members sprayed tear gas into it, leading to Felix's arrest more than 12 hours later. Rigoberto Villanueva, 5 years on death row. Villanueva stabbed his ex to death with a screwdriver in Whitewater and strangled his prison mate in Banning. Israel Guardado, 4 years on death row. He set his own mother on fire. He poured gasoline over his mother's head and lit it. She had 50% of her body burned in the 2nd and 3rd degrees before witnesses could put out the fire. Officer Ryan Kitchens of Indio Police Department stated during the trial that on January 26, 2018, as he parked into the Mattis Brothers parking lot, he was approached by a woman who looked to be suffering from severe burns and had smoke emanating from her body. Francisca Ramirez's skin seemed to be peeling in places, and her garments had been burned off. She strode back and forth, appearing sorrowful, astonished, and rather calm despite the fact that she only spoke Spanish. When her brother found out what happened, he died of a massive heart attack. She also died weeks later in the hospital. Vincent Marples, 4 years on death row. Convicted of torturing his ex-girlfriend for hours, recording parts of the fatal attack on a cell phone video, he drove around with her body until the cops discovered it in a rural Hemet neighborhood. Charles Merritt, 4 years on death row. He killed a family of 4. Merritt received life without parole for the murder of former business associate Joseph McStay, 40, and death for killing McStay's wife, Summer, 43, and their children Gianni, 4, and Joseph Jr., 3. Michael Gargiulo, 3 years on death row. Originating from Glenview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, Gargiulo fatally stabbed 18-year-old Trisha Pacaccio in her backyard. Her father discovered her body the following morning, August 14, 1993. Purportedly fleeing Illinois police investigation, Gargiulo relocated to Los Angeles in 1998. From 2001 to 2008, he committed 2 murders and 1 attempted murder in Southern California. He killed 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin on February 21, 2001 by stabbing her 47 times in her Hollywood home. Ellerin suffered serious punctures to her back, stomach, and chest in addition to a neck wound that almost decapitated her head. Her wounds reached a depth of 6 inches in some cases. Detective Tom Small reported that one of the stabbing wounds actually penetrated the skull and took out a chunk of skull like a puzzle piece. Ellerin had arranged a dinner and drink date with actor Ashton Kutcher for the evening of the murder. Gargiulo fatally stabbed his neighbor, Maria Bruno, 32, in her El Monte, California home on December 1, 2005. She sustained 17 stab wounds. On April 28, 2008, Gargiulo made an attempt to kill Michelle Murphy, a 26-year-old neighbor, at her Santa Monica home. She repelled the assault, and at the scene, blood that matched Gargiulo's DNA was discovered. On June 6, 2008, the Santa Monica Police Department placed Gargiulo under arrest. The Cook County State's Attorney charged Gargiulo of killing Trisha Pacaccio in the first degree on July 7, 2011. It's not clear to me why it took so many years for him to face trial and conviction. His trial was set to start in October 2017 after a pretrial hearing in Los Angeles Superior Court on June 9, 2017. On May 2, 2019, his trial started after some delays. Actor Ashton Kutcher testified about the crimes in May 2019. Gargiulo was found guilty on all counts on August 15, 2019. On October 7 the same year, the penalty phase of his California trial started. After several hours of deliberation, a jury found Gargiulo guilty of capital murder on October 18, 2019. However, defense motions continued to postpone Gargiulo's sentence in California. Finally, on July 16, 2021, Gargiulo received a death sentence. Investigators suspect Gargiulo killed more people because he allegedly informed them in the Los Angeles County Jail that the fact that 10 women were slain and his DNA was found on them does not prove he killed anyone. Jade Harris, 3 years on death row. After replying to an online posting for a car for sale, Harris shot and killed Josemar Rojas, 26, Irene Cardenas Reyes, 35, and Susana Perez Ruelas, 34, on October 24, 2012. Before they were shot in the head, they were shackled and put on their knees. Harris then shot Perez Ruelas to death and her kid, who made it out alive. Adrian Ortiz, 3 years on death row. Ortiz and his girlfriend got into a car fight on the evening of April 21, 2009 in Porterville. Fuming with wrath, Ortiz took out a pistol and fired shots into the dashboard, filling the car with smoke. While driving, Ortiz's girlfriend stopped in front of a home where one of her friend's spouse, and their 2-week-old child were staying. The girlfriend, sobbing, fled the car and made her way to the house to discuss the abusive relationship with her friend. Sitting on the couch with the infant was the friend's husband, who was the victim in this case. When Ortiz tried to carry on the argument through the doorway, the victim ordered him to wait outside. Anderson claimed that once Ortiz started punching his girlfriend, she ran back to the house with him. The victim declared that the door to the house was locked and that he was going to call the police. Taking the gun out of the car, Ortiz threatened to murder the victim if he dialed 911. After that, Anderson claimed, Ortiz kicked down the door and kept threatening, pointing the gun at the victim while he begged him not to murder him. Ortiz led the victim into the kitchen, seated him at the table, and fired a shot to the neck while pointing the gun at his head. The victim later died at the hospital. Ortiz, who was 3 weeks shy of turning 20, fled to Mexico where he was captured by U.S. Marshal in August 2012. Hernan Rodriguez, 3 years on death row. Rodriguez was accused of intentionally shooting a high-powered rifle into a group of field workers having lunch and killing 2 of them. Jesse Torres, 3 years on death row. Torres was found guilty on March 13, 2019, of first-degree murder that occurred during a kidnapping. He abducted 17-year-old Norma Lopez on July 15, 2010, when she was walking to a friend's home from summer school at Valley View High School. Her body was found 5 days later, about 3 miles away. Jesse Gomez, 2 years on death row. Gomez was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with the shooting death of 43-year-old Jonathan de Guzman on July 28, 2016. In addition, the jury found Gomez guilty of attempting to kill Wade Irwin, de Guzman's colleague. De Guzman, a 16-year-old San Diego Police Department veteran, passed away at the hospital, while Irwin spent about a month there after receiving a bullet to the throat. Noel Herrera, 2 years on death row. He is a gang member who has been found guilty of several killings that took place between 2010 and 2017. On January 9, 2010, a 26-year-old man was killed in Herrera's first homicide. The second occurred on April 24, 2014, when authorities said Herrera opened fire during a drive-by shooting, killing a 25-year-old male. Herrera was at the scene of a drive-by shooting on February 15, 2017, although no one was harmed. 3 days later, a 20-year-old guy was shot and murdered by him, according to officials. Herrera was stopped by the police shortly after the third murder, and they discovered a gun that linked him to the shooting on February 15, 2017. Samuel Amador, 1 year on death row. Amador is convicted of killing 4 men: Pedro Rios, Joseph Russell, Michael Wilson, and George Renteria. Desmond Stevenson, 1 year on death row. Robert Green and Desmond Stevenson were taken into custody 3 days after 36-year-old Mitesh Patel was shot to death inside the Boise Drive-In Dairy. Green and Stevenson robbed Patel at the convenience store while holding him at gunpoint. Police claimed that despite Patel giving them the money, Stevenson, a known member of a gang, shot and killed him. Shortly after taking Patel's money and shooting him, the suspects tried to rob Bliss Liquor Store with a gun. Salvador Vasquez Oliva, 1 year on death row. Vasquez Oliva murdered his wife, Angelique Vasquez, and their 2 kids, Alvin and Mia, in March 2017. Additionally, he fatally stabbed Ashley Coleman, his niece. After a family member asked Sacramento police to check on the well-being of the 4 murder victims, the bodies were found inside the Southland Park home. Police officials located and apprehended Vasquez Oliva in the Bay Area within hours of the victims' discoveries. Jose Larin Garcia. He was sentenced this year in 2024. On February 3, 2019, Jose Vladimir Larin Garcia murdered Juan Duarte Raya, 18, Juliana Garcia, 17, Jacob Montgomery, 19, and Carlos Campos Rivera, 25. On February 24, 2023, a little more than 4 years later, the jury recommended that Larin Garcia be executed. When Garcia ran into Campos Rivera outside his apartment complex's gate the night of the killings, he was in a car with 3 of the victims. After firing twice at Campos Rivera, including a fatal blow to the head, Garcia's car fled the scene a few blocks away. During the trial, a neighbor testified that she heard several gunshots, a loud crash, and people screaming from inside the car. Montgomery, Duarte Raya, and Juliana Garcia were found shot in the head, and their bodies were discovered inside the damaged vehicle on Sunny Dunes Road. Juliana Garcia also sustained a hand wound, which is thought to have happened when she attempted to protect herself from the hail of close-range gunshots. Near the crash site, Campos Rivera's body was found by authorities that were investigating the area. Additionally, they discovered Larin Garcia huddled beneath a vehicle a few blocks away from the disabled car, his shoes and jacket taken off, and his body splattered with the victim's blood. Frank Gonzalez, 16 years on death row. Gonzalez was sentenced to death for the first-degree murder and attempted robbery of Maria Rosa, who was gunned down about 6 a.m. on March 28, 2006. The 30-year-old woman was on her way to work at the Sheriff's Inmate Reception Center. Jason Donaldson, 24 years on death row. Sentenced to death in 2004 for the 1998 essay and killing of an Alhambra woman who was locked inside the trunk of her car and left to die after Donaldson set it on fire. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye-bye.